Millionaire caught Black Maid stepping on his mom. What he did was shocking. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the marble foyer of the Manhattan penthouse. Charles Matthews loosened his tie, exhausted from another 14-hour day at his tech firm. It was 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, September 14th, a date that would be burned into his memory forever. He dropped his briefcase by the entrance and walked toward the living room, already thinking about the bourbon waiting for him in the study. But then he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. His mother's voice, weak and strained. "Please, stop." Charles broke into a run. What he saw when he entered the living room made him freeze, his mind struggling to process the scene before him. His 72-year-old mother, Margaret Matthews, was lying face down on the Persian rug, and standing on her back, with both feet planted firmly on his mother's spine, was Helene Washington, their maid. "What the hell are you doing?" Charles's voice exploded across the room. Helene's head snapped up, her brown eyes wide with shock. She immediately stepped off, her hands raised in a gesture of innocence. "Mr. Matthews, I can explain. She asked me to." "Get away from her." Charles rushed to his mother's side, kneeling down. "Mom, are you okay? Can you breathe?" Margaret Matthews let out a theatrical gasp, her face contorted in pain. "Charles? Oh, thank God you're home. She was trying to. I wasn't, I swear. She told me her back hurt and..." Helene's voice cracked with desperation. Charles pulled out his phone, his hands shaking with rage and adrenaline. "Don't say another word. Mr. Matthews, please listen. I said don't speak." He jabbed his finger toward her as he dialed. 911. "What's your emergency?" The operator's calm voice came through the speaker. 911. "What's your emergency?" "I need police and an ambulance at 432 Park Avenue, Penthouse 92. I just caught my employee assaulting my elderly mother. She was standing on her, trying to hurt her." "Sir, is your mother conscious?" "Yes, she's conscious but in pain. Please hurry." Helene stood frozen in the center of the room, tears streaming down her face. Her voice came out in a broken whisper. "I would never hurt Mrs. Matthews. Never. She asked me to help her back pain. She said it was an old remedy her grandmother taught her. I was just trying to help." Charles looked up at her, his eyes cold and hard. Everything he thought he knew about this woman, the kindness he'd observed over 6 months, the gentle way she cared for his mother, the warm smile she gave him each morning, it all shattered in that moment. How could he have been so blind? "Save it for the police," he said flatly. Margaret reached up and grabbed her son's hand weakly. "Charles, I'm scared. What if you hadn't come home when you did?" The sound of sirens grew louder in the distance. Helene sank down onto the arm of the couch, her whole body trembling. She opened her mouth to speak once more, but no words came out. What could she possibly say that would make him believe her now? The sirens stopped right outside the building. Within minutes, footsteps thundered down the hallway. Everything was about to change. For all of them. But the real truth, the actual truth of what happened in that living room, wouldn't come to light for 3 more years. And by then, the damage would already be done. Before we proceed, permit me to welcome you, my lovely family, to another heartwarming story. If you're new here, we wholeheartedly welcome you. To cement your place in this community, please hit the subscribe button now. Don't also forget to hit the notification icon bell to ensure you are the first to see our new story tomorrow. 6 months before that devastating Tuesday evening, life looked entirely different for everyone involved in this story. Charles Matthews had everything a man could want by society's standards. At 38 years old, he'd built a technology empire from nothing. His company, Matthews Analytics, had revolutionized data security for Fortune 500 companies. The money followed, tens of millions of dollars, then hundreds of millions. Forbes estimated his net worth at $340 million, though Charles himself never paid much attention to the number. The penthouse at 432 Park Avenue wasn't just a home, it was a statement. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Central Park. Imported marble covered the floors. Original Rothko paintings hung on the walls. But despite all the luxury, despite all the success, Charles felt something missing. He couldn't quite name it, that hollow feeling that crept in during quiet moments. His father, Richard Matthews, had died 2 years earlier from a sudden heart attack. The loss had devastated Charles, but it had absolutely shattered his mother. Margaret Matthews had been married to Richard for 47 years. They'd built everything together, the business in its early days, the family, the legacy. When Richard died, a light went out inside Margaret. Charles did what any devoted son would do. He invited his mother to live with him. She'd sold the family estate in Connecticut and moved into the penthouse. For a while, having her there helped them both. They grieved together. They remembered together. They healed, or at least they tried to. But Margaret wasn't getting any younger. At 72, she needed more care than Charles could provide while running his company. She had arthritis in her knees, high blood pressure, and the beginnings of osteoporosis. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to make daily tasks challenging. That's when Helene Washington entered their lives. The employment agency sent over 12 candidates. Charles interviewed them all personally. He needed someone capable, someone trustworthy, someone who would treat his mother with dignity and kindness. Most of the candidates were qualified on paper, but something felt off about each of them. Too impersonal, too formal, too focused on the paycheck. Then Helene walked through the door on a rainy March morning. She was 26 years old, originally from a small town outside Savannah, Georgia. She'd moved to New York 3 years earlier, chasing the same dream that drew millions to the city. A better life, more opportunities, a chance to build something meaningful. But New York had been harder than she'd imagined. The jobs she could get barely covered rent for a tiny apartment in Queens that she shared with 2 other women. Helene was a single mother. Her daughter, Jasmine, was 7 years old and living with Helene's mother back in Georgia. Every cent Helene could spare went back home to support them. She video called Jasmine every night before bed, reading her stories through a cracked phone screen, promising that soon, very soon, they'd be together again. During the interview, Charles noticed something different about Helene. She didn't just talk about her qualifications or her experience. She asked questions about Margaret. What did she like to eat? What were her hobbies? What made her laugh? Did she prefer mornings or evenings? Was she comfortable with physical therapy exercises? Margaret sat in on the interview, quietly observing from the corner of the room. When Charles asked if she had any questions for Helene, Margaret smiled for the first time in weeks. "Do you like crossword puzzles, dear?" Helene's face lit up. "I love them, Mrs. Matthews. My grandmother and I used to do the Sunday Times puzzle together every week. She'd make sweet tea and we'd sit on her porch for hours, arguing over the answers." Margaret's eyes grew moist. "Richard and I did the same thing." Charles hired Helene on the spot. Over the following months, something remarkable happened. The penthouse, which had felt like a beautiful mausoleum, began to feel like a home again. Helene arrived every morning at 7 with a warm smile and genuine enthusiasm. She cooked meals that reminded Margaret of her own Southern childhood, even though Margaret was from Massachusetts. Helene had a gift for making people feel cared for. She helped Margaret with her physical therapy exercises, cheering her on with patience and humor. She organized Margaret's medications and doctor's appointments with meticulous attention. She did crossword puzzles with her every afternoon, the two of them sitting by the window overlooking the park, laughing when they got stuck on particularly difficult clues. But more than the practical help, Helene brought warmth. She told stories about her daughter, about growing up in Georgia, about her dreams of one day opening a small bakery. Her grandmother had been a legendary baker in their town, known for her peach cobbler and sweet potato pie. Helene had inherited both the recipes and the talent. Sometimes, when Charles came home from work, he'd find Margaret and Helene in the kitchen together, Helene teaching Margaret to make cornbread or collard greens. His mother would have flour on her nose and joy on her face. Those moments made Charles realize how isolated Margaret had become in her grief, and how much she'd needed exactly this kind of companionship. Charles found himself coming home earlier. He'd linger in the kitchen, accepting the plate Helene offered him, joining the conversation. Helene never overstepped, never acted too familiar, but there was an ease between them that felt natural. She'd ask about his day with genuine interest. She'd offer perspective on problems he was facing at work with surprising insight. One evening in late August, Charles walked into the living room and found Helene reading aloud to Margaret from a novel they'd been working through together. Margaret had fallen asleep in her chair, a peaceful expression on her face. Helene noticed Charles and carefully marked the page, pulling a blanket over Margaret's shoulders with such tenderness that something shifted in Charles's chest. "She had a good day today," Helene whispered, walking toward the foyer where Charles stood. "We walked around the block this morning. She made it the whole way without stopping. She was so proud of herself." Charles smiled. "Thank you, Helene, for everything you do. I don't say it enough, but you've given my mother her life back." Helene's eyes glistened. "She's given me something too, Mr. Matthews. She makes me feel less alone in this big city. She reminds me of my own grandmother." There was a moment, just a brief second, where their eyes met and something unspoken passed between them. Something that went beyond employer and employee, beyond gratitude and duty. Something that felt like recognition, like two souls acknowledging each other across all the barriers of class and circumstance. Charles cleared his throat and stepped back. "Well, I should let you get home. I'm sure you're tired." Helene nodded, gathering her things. "Good night, Mr. Matthews." "Good night, Helene." Neither of them realized that someone had been watching that exchange very carefully. Margaret Matthews had not been asleep at all, and what she'd witnessed in that moment between her son and their maid had set off every alarm in her protective, controlling heart. Margaret had not raised her son and built a dynasty just to watch him fall for the help. In her mind, shaped by decades of high society expectations and unexamined prejudices, this was unacceptable. Charles needed to be with someone appropriate, someone from their world, someone who understood their life, someone like her friend's daughter, Alice. The seeds of destruction were planted that night, in the quiet observation of a moment that felt like possibility. Margaret Matthews began to plan. She told herself she was protecting her son. She told herself she was doing what any good mother would do. She told herself many things to justify what she was about to set in motion. But the truth, the real truth, was that Margaret couldn't stand the idea of losing control. She couldn't stand that a young black woman from Georgia, someone she'd initially welcomed into their home, might take her place as the most important woman in Charles's life. And so, with cold calculation dressed up as maternal love, Margaret Matthews began to weave a trap. One that would destroy an innocent woman's life and nearly destroy her own son's soul in the process. The countdown to that terrible Tuesday evening had begun, and no one saw it coming. Margaret Matthews had always been a patient woman. When you've spent nearly 5 decades navigating high society, managing a husband's career, and maintaining a family's reputation, you learn that the best plans unfold slowly, carefully, without detection. The day after she witnessed that moment between Charles and Helene, Margaret made a phone call. "Patricia, darling, it's been too long. How is Alice doing these days?" Patricia Thornton was an old friend from the country club circuit, and Alice Thornton was her 32-year-old daughter. Beautiful in that polished, expensive way that money and good breeding produced. She had a master's degree from Columbia that she'd never really used, preferring instead to serve on charity boards and attend gallery openings. Alice had been married once, briefly, to a hedge fund manager who'd been caught with his assistant. The divorce had been swift and lucrative. Margaret had known Alice since she was a child. The girl was intelligent, cunning even, and she understood how the world really worked. She'd be perfect for Charles. "Alice is wonderful," Patricia replied, "though I worry she's getting lonely. You know how it is after a divorce. Men are intimidated by a woman with her pedigree." Margaret smiled into the phone. "I think I might have a solution. Why don't you and Alice join me for lunch this week? I'd love to catch up." 3 days later, Margaret sat across from Alice at Le Bernardin, one of Manhattan's most prestigious restaurants. She'd told Helene she had a doctor's appointment and wouldn't need her that afternoon. Charles was traveling to San Francisco for meetings. It was the perfect opportunity. Alice Thornton was stunning in person. Blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon, designer dress that probably cost more than Helene made in a month, and eyes that were simultaneously warm and calculating. She knew exactly why Margaret had invited her to lunch. "Your son is doing remarkably well," Alice said, sipping her wine. "I saw that profile in the Wall Street Journal. Very impressive." Margaret leaned forward. "Charles has accomplished so much, but he's been alone for too long. Since his father died, he's buried himself in work. He needs someone who understands his world, someone who can stand beside him as he continues to build his legacy." Alice set down her glass. "I'm listening. He needs someone like you, Alice. Someone refined. Someone appropriate." The word hung in the air between them, loaded with all its ugly implications. Alice's lips curved into a small smile. "And what exactly is preventing him from finding this appropriate someone?" Margaret's jaw tightened. "He's become distracted. Our maid, a young woman, she's perfectly nice, but she's been getting ideas above her station. I've seen the way she looks at him, the way she positions herself to be in his presence. It's calculated." This was, of course, a complete fabrication. Helene had never done anything inappropriate, but Margaret had spent decades spinning narratives, and she was expert at making her lies sound like concerned observations. Alice understood immediately. She'd grown up in the same circles, learned the same unspoken rules about who belonged where. The idea of Charles Matthews, millionaire tech mogul, falling for the help, it was the kind of scandal that their social circle would devour. "What do you need from me?" Alice asked. "First, we need to remove the distraction. Then, I need you to be there when Charles needs someone. The timing will be crucial." Alice nodded slowly. "I assume you have a plan?" Margaret did. She'd been refining it for days, thinking through every detail, every possible outcome. It was risky, certainly, but Margaret had always been willing to do whatever was necessary to protect her family's interests, as she defined them. "I need your help with something," Margaret said quietly, "something that will ensure this girl is removed from our lives permanently. Are you willing?" Alice thought about Charles Matthews. She thought about his fortune, his status, the life she could have as his wife. She thought about how boring her days had become, how much she missed having real purpose, even if that purpose was simply securing a wealthy husband. "Tell me what you need," Alice said. Over the next hour, Margaret laid out her plan. It was cruel, it was calculated, and it would destroy an innocent woman's life. But Margaret had convinced herself that she was doing the right thing. In her mind, she was saving her son from making a terrible mistake. She was protecting everything they'd built. Alice listened, asked questions, and agreed to everything. They scheduled it for 2 weeks out, giving them time to set all the pieces in place. The first step was for Margaret to get closer to Helene, to lower her guard even further. When Margaret returned home that afternoon, she was warmer to Helene than ever before. She started sharing more personal stories, asking about Helene's daughter, expressing interest in her dreams of opening a bakery someday. "You know, dear," Margaret said one evening as they did their crossword puzzle, "you've become like family to me. I hope you know how much I appreciate you." Helene's eyes filled with grateful tears. "That means everything to me, Mrs. Matthews. You and Mr. Matthews have been so kind. This job, it's changed my life. I'm finally able to save money to bring my daughter here. Maybe by next year if I keep working hard." Margaret patted her hand, hiding her disgust at having to touch the help. "That's wonderful, dear. You deserve every happiness." All the while, Margaret was studying Helene's schedule, her routines, the times when Charles would be out and when he'd be returning home. She needed everything to be perfect. Alice, meanwhile, began positioning herself in Charles's orbit. She showed up at a charity gala she knew he'd be attending. She arranged to be at the same restaurant when he was having a business dinner. Each time, she played it casual, surprised to see him, but engaging him in intelligent conversation. She was planting seeds, making sure he'd remember her when the time came. Charles, for his part, found Alice pleasant enough. She was smart, attractive, and from a world he understood. But every conversation with her felt hollow compared to the easy warmth he felt when talking with Helene. Still, he was a man trained in social graces, so he was polite and friendly. The 2 weeks passed quickly. Margaret's plan was ready. September 14th, a Tuesday, was selected because Margaret knew Charles had meetings downtown that would end precisely at 6:30 p.m. Traffic would put him home around 6:45 p.m. Helene's shift ended at 7 p.m. The chaos that erupted in the following minutes would replay in Helene's mind for years to come, each detail sharp and painful, like shards of broken glass. After Charles made the 911 call, he knelt beside his mother, helping her sit up slowly. Margaret played her part perfectly, wincing and gasping, one hand pressed to her lower back. The performance was Oscar-worthy. Tears streamed down her face. Her whole body trembled, and she looked every bit the fragile elderly victim of a vicious assault. Helene stood frozen in the center of the living room, her mind racing to make sense of what was happening. This had to be a misunderstanding. Once Mrs. Matthews could breathe properly, once she could explain to Charles what they'd actually been doing, everything would be fine. It had to be fine. "Mr. Matthews, please, just listen." Helene tried again, her voice shaking. "Your mother asked me to do this. She said it was an old remedy for back pain. I could never hurt her. She's been like family to me." Charles didn't even look at her. He was entirely focused on his mother, checking her for injuries, his face a mask of controlled fury. The man who'd smiled at her over dinner conversation, who'd thanked her for her care, who'd looked at her with what she thought might be something more than professional appreciation, that man had vanished. In his place was a stranger with ice in his eyes. The paramedics arrived first, rushing in with their equipment. They quickly assessed Margaret, asking questions about pain levels and mobility. She told them she had difficulty breathing, that her back felt like it might be broken, that she was terrified. All lies delivered with the conviction of truth. The police officers arrived 3 minutes later. Two of them, one older white officer with gray at his temples, and a younger black female officer with kind eyes. Helene felt a flash of desperate hope when she saw the second officer. Maybe she would understand. Maybe she would listen. The older officer, whose name tag read Morrison, took control of the situation immediately. "Sir, I'm Officer Morrison. Can you tell me exactly what happened here?" Charles stood, his voice tight and controlled. "I came home from work and found my employee standing on my elderly mother. She was on her back, pressing down on her spine. My mother was crying and asking her to stop." Officer Morrison turned to look at Helene for the first time. His expression shifted when he took her in. A young black woman in worn jeans and a simple t-shirt, standing in this palace of wealth and privilege. She could see him making assumptions, drawing conclusions. She'd seen that look before, on countless faces throughout her life. The look that said she didn't belong here, that she must have done something wrong. "Ma'am, is this true?" he asked. "No, yes, I was standing on her back, but she asked me to. She said she was in pain and I never asked her to do anything," Margaret interrupted, her voice weak but clear. "I was lying down trying to ease my back pain on my own when she came in and forced me to stay down. She put her feet on me. I begged her to stop, but she wouldn't listen. If my son hadn't come home when he did, I don't know what she might have done." Helene's mouth fell open. "That's not true. Mrs. Matthews, why are you lying? You asked me to help you. You said your grandmother used to do this. You said, 'I think you need to come with us, ma'am,'" Officer Morrison said, his hand moving to his belt where his handcuffs hung. The younger officer, whose name tag read Jackson, stepped forward. "Maybe we should take statements from everyone separately? Get a clear picture of what happened." But Morrison shook his head. "We have the victim's testimony. We have the son's eyewitness account. This seems pretty clear-cut to me." "Please," Helene's voice broke, "please just check the security cameras. Mr. Matthews has cameras everywhere in this apartment. Check them. They'll show you that I'm telling the truth." Charles's expression flickered for just a second, something like doubt crossing his features. But then Margaret reached up and grabbed his hand. "Charles, I'm frightened. Please, I just want this woman out of our home." The doubt vanished. Charles looked at Officer Morrison. "I want her arrested. I want her charged with assault, with attempted harm, with whatever applies here. My mother is 72 years old. What this woman did is unconscionable." Helene felt her world tilting sideways. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. Officer Morrison approached her. "Ma'am, I'm placing you under arrest for assault. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The Miranda rights washed over her like white noise. She felt the cold metal of the handcuffs click around her wrists. She saw Charles turn away from her, unable or unwilling to watch. She saw Margaret watching with those cold, satisfied eyes, and in that moment, Helene finally understood. This had been planned. This had been a trap, and she'd walked right into it. "My phone," Helene said desperately as Officer Jackson led her toward the door. "I need to call someone. My daughter, she's expecting me to call her tonight. My mother, she'll worry if I don't check in. Please, you can make your phone call at the station," Jackson said gently. There was sympathy in her voice, but she was still doing her job, still leading Helene away. As they walked through the foyer, past the expensive art and the gleaming marble, Helene looked back one more time. Charles was standing in the archway to the living room, his face illuminated by the chandelier above. For a split second, their eyes met, and in that split second, Helene saw something that gave her a fragment of hope, confusion. He wasn't entirely certain. Some part of him questioned what he'd seen. But then Margaret called out, "Charles, I need you," and he turned away. The elevator ride down 92 floors felt like descending into hell. Officer Jackson stood beside Helene in uncomfortable silence. When they reached the lobby, Helene saw the doorman, Marcus, a kind older man who always greeted her warmly. His eyes went wide when he saw her in handcuffs. "Miss Helene?" he said, shocked. "It's a mistake, Marcus," she said, her voice hollow. "It's all a terrible mistake." But was it? She'd been naive enough to trust Margaret Matthews. She'd been naive enough to believe that kindness and hard work would be enough in a world that had never been designed for people like her. Maybe the mistake had been hers all along. The police car ride to the precinct was a blur. The booking process was dehumanizing. Fingerprints, mugshot, personal belongings confiscated. She was allowed her phone call and she chose her mother. "Mama!" Helene's voice cracked as soon as she heard her mother's voice. "Baby? What's wrong? You sound upset." "Mama, I've been arrested. I'm at a police station in Manhattan. They're saying I assaulted Mrs. Matthews, but I didn't, Mama. I swear to you I didn't. She asked me to help her, and then she lied about what happened, and now they think I tried to hurt her." Her mother's gasp was audible. "Lord Jesus. Baby, hang on. I'm going to call Uncle Jerome's friend, that lawyer he knows. We're going to figure this out. Mama, tell Jasmine I'm sorry. Tell her I love her. Tell her Mommy will call her as soon as I can. You'll tell her yourself, you hear me? Don't you give up. We're going to fight this." But fighting required resources they didn't have. Uncle Jerome's lawyer friend was a small-time attorney in Savannah who handled wills and property disputes. He had no experience with criminal cases in New York, and he certainly didn't have the ability to take on a case pro bono. Helene was assigned a public defender named David Stein. He was 42 years old, overworked, underpaid, and handling 73 active cases. When he met with Helene for the first time, 2 days after her arrest, he spent exactly 23 minutes with her. "Look, Ms. Washington," he said, not unkindly. "The prosecution has the victim's testimony, her son's eyewitness account, and medical documentation of injuries to Mrs. Matthews's back. You admit you were standing on her. That's assault, no matter what you claim she asked you to do." "But the security cameras," Helene insisted. "Mr. Matthews has cameras throughout the apartment. They'll show you that Mrs. Matthews asked me to do this." Stein made a note. "I'll request the footage. But understand that even if there's footage of her asking you to do this, which is a big if, you still committed an act that caused her injury. The best play here might be a plea deal. Reduce charges, maybe probation instead of prison time." "I'm not pleading guilty to something I didn't do wrong," Helene said firmly. Stein sighed. He'd heard this before, this stubborn insistence on innocence from clients who didn't understand how the system really worked. "Think about it. Going to trial is a risk. Juries are unpredictable, especially when you have a wealthy elderly white victim and well, you understand the optics." Helene understood. The optics were that she was a young black woman accused of hurting a rich white matriarch. The optics were terrible, but she also understood that accepting a plea deal would mean admitting guilt for something she hadn't done. It would mean having a criminal record, which would make it impossible to find work, impossible to bring her daughter to New York, impossible to build the life she'd been working toward. "I want to go to trial," she said quietly. The bail hearing was set for the following week. The prosecutor, an ambitious young woman named Claire Henderson, argued that Helene was a flight risk and a danger to the community. She painted a picture of a calculating woman who'd won the trust of a vulnerable elderly woman and her wealthy son, only to abuse that trust in a violent manner. Helene's public defender argued weekly for reasonable bail, citing her lack of criminal record and strong family ties. The judge, a stern-faced man in his 60s, set bail at $50,000. $50,000. An impossible sum. Helene's entire family pooled their resources and managed to scrape together $5,000 for a bail bondsman. But it wasn't enough. The bondsman required 20% down, plus collateral. They had neither. Helene stayed in jail. The days blurred into weeks. She was housed in a section of Rikers Island reserved for women awaiting trial. The conditions were harsh. Overcrowded cells. Violence that erupted without warning. Guard indifference bordering on cruelty. But the worst part was the isolation from her daughter. She could make brief phone calls, but hearing Jasmine's voice asking when mommy was coming home was like a knife to the heart every single time. Soon, baby, Helene would lie. Mommy's just working on something important, but I'll be home soon. Meanwhile, the media had picked up the story. Millionaires Maid arrested for assault read the headline in the New York Post. The article painted Helene as someone who'd clearly been jealous of the Matthews family wealth, who'd snapped under pressure, who'd shown her true colors. Some outlets went further, dragging up every stereotype about black women being angry, aggressive, dangerous. They found her Facebook photos and analyzed them for signs of criminality. They interviewed people who claimed to know her, though most of them were strangers making things up for their 15 minutes of fame. A few voices tried to defend her. A cousin wrote a heartfelt Facebook post about Helene's character. Her former employer at a diner in Queens gave an interview calling her the kindest person she'd ever known. But these voices were drowned out by the louder narrative of guilt. The trial began 3 weeks later. The courtroom was intimidating, all dark wood and formal procedure. Helene sat at the defense table in an ill-fitting suit that her public defender had brought her, trying to look respectable, trying to look innocent. Charles Matthews took the stand first, looking uncomfortable in his tailored suit. He recounted what he'd seen, his voice steady but his eyes never quite meeting Helene's. She wanted to scream at him, to demand that he look at her, to remind him of all the months of care she'd given his mother, all the conversations they'd shared. But she sat silent, as her lawyer had instructed. Then Margaret took the stand. She was dressed in conservative clothing that made her look even older and more vulnerable than she was. She told her story with perfect precision, her voice wavering at all the right moments, her tears appearing exactly when they'd have maximum impact. She described Helene as someone who'd seemed trustworthy at first but had gradually shown signs of instability. She claimed Helene had been angry that day, that she'd forced Margaret down and refused to stop hurting her despite her pleas. Every word was a lie, delivered with the confidence of a woman who'd spent a lifetime learning how to manipulate people. When Helene's public defender cross-examined Margaret, she remained unflappable. Yes, she'd liked Helene at first. No, she'd never asked Helene to stand on her back. Yes, she was absolutely certain of what had happened. No, she had no reason to lie. The security footage was never presented. When Stein had requested it, Charles's lawyers had claimed there was no footage from that particular evening, that the system had malfunctioned. It was entirely possible, they said. Technology failed sometimes. Helene knew it was a lie. She'd seen those cameras. They were high-end, redundant systems that backed up to cloud servers. But proving that required technical expertise and investigation, things her overworked public defender didn't have the time or resources for. Helene herself took the stand on the second day of the trial. She told her truth as clearly as she could. She explained about Margaret's request, about her hesitation, about her desire to help someone she cared about. She talked about her daughter, her dreams, her character. The prosecutor tore her apart on cross-examination. Why would Mrs. Matthews lie? What possible motive could she have? Isn't it true that Helene had been trying to get closer to Charles Matthews? Isn't it true that she'd overstepped her position as an employee? Isn't it possible that she'd been angry when her advances were rejected? That's not true, Helene said desperately. I never made advances toward Mr. Matthews. We were friendly, but it was always appropriate. I never did anything wrong, but the prosecutor had planted the seed. The jury was looking at her differently now, seeing her through the lens of every stereotype about black women seducing wealthy white men, about staff taking advantage of their employers. The trial lasted 3 days total. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty. Helene felt the word like a physical blow. Guilty of assault. Guilty of elder abuse. The judge would determine sentencing in 2 weeks. When sentencing day came, Helene stood before the judge with tears streaming down her face. Her public defender made a brief argument for leniency, citing her lack of criminal history. The prosecutor argued for the maximum sentence, calling Helene a dangerous individual who'd violated the trust of a vulnerable woman. $50,000. An impossible sum. Helene's entire family pooled their resources and managed to scrape together $5,000 for a bail bondsman. But it wasn't enough. The bondsman required 20% down, plus collateral. They had neither. Helene stayed in jail. The days blurred into weeks. She was housed in a section of Rikers Island reserved for women awaiting trial. The conditions were harsh. Overcrowded cells. Violence that erupted without warning. Guard indifference bordering on cruelty. But the worst part was the isolation from her daughter. She could make brief phone calls, but hearing Jasmine's voice asking when mommy was coming home was like a knife to the heart every single time. Soon, baby, Helene would lie. Mommy's just working on something important, but I'll be home soon. Meanwhile, the media had picked up the story. Millionaires made arrested for assault, read the headline in the New York Post. The article painted Helene as someone who'd clearly been jealous of the Matthews family wealth, who'd snapped under pressure, who'd shown her true colors. Some outlets went further, dragging up every stereotype about black women being angry, aggressive, dangerous. They found her Facebook photos and analyzed them for signs of criminality. They interviewed people who claimed to know her, though most of them were strangers making things up for their 15 minutes of fame. A few voices tried to defend her. A cousin wrote a heartfelt Facebook post about Helene's character. Her former employer at a diner in Queens gave an interview calling her the kindest person she'd ever known. But these voices were drowned out by the louder narrative of guilt. The trial began 3 weeks later. The courtroom was intimidating, all dark wood and formal procedure. Helene sat at the defense table in an ill-fitting suit that her public defender had brought her, trying to look respectable, trying to look innocent. Charles Matthews took the stand first, looking uncomfortable in his tailored suit. He recounted what he'd seen, his voice steady but his eyes never quite meeting Helene's. She wanted to scream at him, to demand that he look at her, to remind him of all the months of care she'd given his mother, all the conversations they'd shared. But she sat silent, as her lawyer had instructed. Then Margaret took the stand. She was dressed in conservative clothing that made her look even older and more vulnerable than she was. She told her story with perfect precision, her voice wavering at all the right moments, her tears appearing exactly when they'd have maximum impact. She described Helene as someone who'd seemed trustworthy at first but had gradually shown signs of instability. She claimed Helene had been angry that day, that she'd forced Margaret down and refused to stop hurting her despite her pleas. Every word was a lie, delivered with the confidence of a woman who'd spent a lifetime learning how to manipulate people. When Helene's public defender cross-examined Margaret, she remained unflappable. Yes, she'd liked Helene at first. No, she'd never asked Helene to stand on her back. Yes, she was absolutely certain of what had happened. No, she had no reason to lie. The security footage was never presented. When Stein had requested it, Charles's lawyers had claimed there was no footage from that particular evening, that the system had malfunctioned. It was entirely possible, they said. Technology failed sometimes. Helene knew it was a lie. She'd seen those cameras. They were high-end, redundant systems that backed up to cloud servers. But proving that required technical expertise and investigation, things her overworked public defender didn't have the time or resources for. Helene herself took the stand on the second day of the trial. She told her truth as clearly as she could. She explained about Margaret's request, about her hesitation, about her desire to help someone she cared about. She talked about her daughter, her dreams, her character. The prosecutor tore her apart on cross-examination. Why would Mrs. Matthews lie? What possible motive could she have? Isn't it true that Helene had been trying to get closer to Charles Matthews? Isn't it true that she'd overstepped her position as an employee? Isn't it possible that she'd been angry when her advances were rejected? That's not true. Helene said desperately, I never made advances toward Mr. Matthews. We were friendly, but it was always appropriate. I never did anything wrong, but the prosecutor had planted the seed. The jury was looking at her differently now, seeing her through the lens of every stereotype about black women seducing wealthy white men, about staff taking advantage of their employers. The trial lasted 3 days total. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty. Helene felt the word like a physical blow. Guilty of assault. Guilty of elder abuse. The judge would determine sentencing in 2 weeks. When sentencing day came, Helene stood before the judge with tears streaming down her face. Her public defender made a brief argument for leniency, citing her lack of criminal history. The prosecutor argued for the maximum sentence, calling Helene a dangerous individual who'd violated the trust of a vulnerable woman. The judge sentenced her to 5 years in prison. 5 years of her life, taken because she tried to help someone. 5 years away from her daughter. 5 years for a crime she didn't commit. As the bailiff led her away, Helene looked back one more time at the courtroom. Charles Matthews was sitting in the back row, his face pale and drawn. For just a moment, their eyes met again. And this time she saw something clear in his expression. Guilt. Somewhere deep inside, whether he admitted it to himself or not, Charles Matthews knew something was wrong with this entire situation. But knowing wasn't enough. He'd allowed his anger and his trust in his mother to blind him to the truth. And now an innocent woman would spend the next 5 years behind bars for the crime of being compassionate. As Helene was led back to holding, she made herself a promise. She would survive this. She would be strong for Jasmine. And somehow, some way, the truth would come out. It had to, because a world where kindness could be weaponized so effectively, where lies could triumph so completely, that wasn't a world she was willing to accept. Even if, for now, she had no choice but to live in it. Sometimes the stories that haunt us most are the ones where justice fails, where good people suffer for the crime of being decent. If you've ever felt the weight of injustice, if you've ever wondered how such things can happen in the world we live in, then you understand why this story matters. These are the stories we need to tell, the ones that remind us to look deeper, to question what we see on the surface. Stay with us because the truth, when it finally comes, will change everything. The penthouse felt different after Helene's arrest. Emptier. Charles tried to tell himself it was because they now had to manage without domestic help, but he knew that wasn't the real reason. The warmth that had slowly returned to their home over the past 6 months had vanished overnight, replaced by a cold silence that reminded him too much of the months after his father's death. Margaret recovered remarkably quickly from her supposed injuries. Within days, she was moving around normally, with no sign of the severe back pain she'd claimed. When Charles mentioned this, she simply said that the pain had resolved itself, that she'd been lucky no permanent damage was done. "That woman could have killed me," Margaret would say whenever Helene's name came up. "Thank God you came home when you did." Charles nodded, but something gnawed at him. In the quiet moments, when he was alone in his study late at night, he found himself replaying that scene in his mind. Helene's face, her genuine shock and confusion, her insistence that his mother had asked for her help, the desperation in her voice when she'd begged him to check the security cameras. The security cameras. He'd meant to review them himself that first night, but in the chaos of police and paramedics and his mother's distress, he'd forgotten. His lawyers had been the ones to respond to the public defender's request for footage. They'd told him the system had malfunctioned, that there was no footage from that evening. But Charles knew his security system. He'd personally overseen its installation. It was state-of-the-art with redundant backups precisely to prevent data loss. The likelihood of it failing at that exact time seemed improbable. Still, he pushed the doubts away. His mother wouldn't lie to him. And he'd seen what he'd seen with his own eyes. Helene standing on his mother's back. His mother asking her to stop. He'd seen it. Hadn't he? 3 weeks after the arrest, Margaret brought up the subject of Alice Thornton over breakfast. "You remember Patricia's daughter, don't you, dear? Alice? We ran into her at that gala last month." Charles looked up from his newspaper. Vaguely. "Why?" "She's been asking after you. I think she might be interested in reconnecting. She's such a lovely girl, Charles. Smart. Accomplished. From a good family." There was something in his mother's tone that set off alarm bells. Too casual, too studied. But Charles was exhausted from work and emotionally drained from the trial that was underway. He didn't have the energy to analyze his mother's motives. "I'm not really interested in dating right now, Mom. I'm not suggesting you marry her tomorrow," Margaret said with a light laugh. "But it wouldn't hurt to have dinner with her, would it? You've been working yourself to death. You need some companionship, some distraction." Distraction. That's what Margaret really meant. Distraction from thoughts of Helene, from the doubts that kept surfacing no matter how hard he tried to suppress them. Against his better judgment, Charles agreed to dinner with Alice. She met him at 11 Madison Park, looking stunning in a black dress that probably cost more than most people made in a month. Alice was charming, witty, and attentive. She asked intelligent questions about his work and shared amusing anecdotes about the art world. She was exactly the kind of woman he was supposed to be with, according to every social expectation he'd grown up with, and he felt absolutely nothing. Still, it was pleasant enough. When Alice suggested a second date, Charles agreed, mostly because refusing seemed rude and because his mother would be pleased. One dinner became 2, then 3. Alice was patient, never pushing too hard, always knowing exactly how to navigate the dance of wealthy courtship. Meanwhile, the trial concluded. Helene was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years. The news hit Charles harder than he'd expected. He found himself drinking more, sleeping less. At work, his assistants noticed he'd become short-tempered and distracted. The night after Helene's sentencing, Charles dreamed about her. In the dream, she was standing in his living room, but not on his mother. She was just standing there, looking at him with those kind eyes, asking him a simple question: "Why didn't you believe me?" He woke up at 3 a.m., covered in sweat, and couldn't get back to sleep. Margaret noticed his distress and increased her campaign with Alice. She arranged dinner parties where Alice was always invited. She left magazines around the house with articles about Alice's charity work. She mentioned casually how much Patricia hoped they might end up together. 6 months after Helene's arrest, Charles and Alice were officially a couple. Not because of passion or love, but because it was the path of least resistance. Alice fit into his life seamlessly. She knew how to navigate his business dinners, how to make small talk with his clients' wives, how to present the perfect image of success and sophistication. She moved through his world like she'd been designed for it, which in a sense, she had been. What Charles didn't see was the way Alice and Margaret would exchange glances across the dinner table, small smiles of satisfaction, like co-conspirators celebrating a successful plan. He didn't notice how Alice never asked about Helene, never expressed curiosity about what had really happened that day. Most people, if they were starting a relationship with him, would want to know about something so dramatic. But Alice had no questions because she already knew all the answers. A year after Helene's arrest, Charles proposed to Alice. He did it at the restaurant where they'd had their first date, with a 5-carat diamond ring that sparkled under the chandelier light. Alice said yes with exactly the right amount of surprise and joy, though they both knew it had been inevitable. The wedding was scheduled for 3 months later. It was a grand affair at the plaza, with 300 guests, a famous band, and flowers flown in from Ecuador. Alice wore a Vera Wang gown that had taken 6 months of fittings. Charles wore a custom Tom Ford tuxedo and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Margaret watched from the front row, radiant with satisfaction. Everything had worked out exactly as she'd planned. Helene was locked away where she belonged. Charles had married appropriately. The family reputation was intact. Life was back to the way it should be. As Charles stood at the altar, waiting for Alice to walk down the aisle, he found his mind wandering to a memory from a year earlier. Helene in the kitchen, teaching his mother to make cornbread. The sound of their laughter, the warmth that had filled the penthouse during those months. He blinked hard, pushing the memory away. This was his wedding day. He needed to focus on his future with Alice, not dwell on the past. Alice glided down the aisle on her father's arm, picture perfect in white satin and lace. When she reached the altar, she handed her bouquet to her maid of honor and took Charles's hands in hers. They were cold, he noticed, or maybe his were. The officiant began speaking. Charles went through the motions, saying his vows at the appropriate times. When the officiant asked if anyone had any reason these two should not be married, there was the traditional pause. Charles found himself holding his breath, almost hoping someone would object, would give him an excuse to stop this hollow proceeding. But of course no one did. "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Charles leaned in and kissed Alice. The guests applauded. The band began to play. It was official. He was married to a woman he didn't love, a woman he barely knew if he was honest with himself. As they walked back down the aisle together, Alice's arm linked through his. Charles caught sight of his mother dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Happy tears, supposedly, but there was something else in her expression. Something that looked almost like relief. The reception was a blur of champagne toasts and forced smiles. Charles danced with Alice for their first dance, moving mechanically through the steps they'd rehearsed. Friends and colleagues came by to offer congratulations, to tell him how lucky he was, to comment on what a perfect couple they made. Perfect. That word kept coming up. They were perfect together. The perfect match. The perfect power couple. Perfect, perfect, perfect. But perfection, Charles was learning, could feel an awful lot like emptiness. Later that night, in the honeymoon suite at the plaza, Alice emerged from the bathroom in expensive lingerie, her hair down around her shoulders. She looked beautiful, objectively speaking, but when she came to bed and kissed him, Charles felt like he was going through the motions of someone else's life. They consummated their marriage with all the passion of a business transaction. Afterward, Alice fell asleep almost immediately, her breathing steady and undisturbed. Charles lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how he'd ended up here. How he'd gone from a man who'd once felt genuine warmth and possibility to a man going through the motions of a life he didn't actually want. In a prison cell 200 miles away, Helene Washington lay awake too. She'd learned that Charles Matthews had gotten married. Another inmate had seen it mentioned in the society pages of a newspaper. The inmate had taken great pleasure in telling Helene, knowing it would hurt her. And it did hurt. Not because Helene had been in love with Charles, though she'd felt something for him. The beginning of something that might have been love if circumstances had been different. It hurt because it meant he'd moved on completely. The man who'd once looked at her with warmth and respect had replaced her as easily as replacing broken furniture. She'd lost everything, her freedom, her daughter, her dreams, while he'd simply found a replacement and continued his life as if she'd never existed. But Helene made herself a promise that night, just as she had on the day of her sentencing. She would survive this. She would get through each day, each month, each year. And when she was finally free, she would rebuild her life. What she couldn't know, what no one could know yet, was that the truth was sitting in a dusty box in a forgotten storage closet in Charles Matthews's study. Security backup drives that hadn't been erased, that held footage from the day that had destroyed her life. The truth was waiting. It just needed to be found. And in 2 years' time, on an ordinary evening when Charles was searching for something else entirely, he would find it. 2 years of marriage had taught Charles Matthews many things, though perhaps the most important lesson was this: you can live with someone and still be utterly alone. Alice was a perfect wife by every conventional measure. She managed their social calendar flawlessly, hosted dinner parties that were the talk of Manhattan, served on the boards of prestigious charities, and never embarrassed him in public. She maintained her appearance impeccably, dressed in designer clothes, and photographed well for the society pages. But she was also cold in ways that Charles had initially mistaken for sophistication. Their conversations never went deeper than surface pleasantries. She showed no real interest in his work beyond how it affected their social standing. Their physical relationship had become perfunctory, scheduled around her monthly spa appointments and his travel schedule. Most tellingly, she had no real friends, only social connections. No hobbies beyond shopping and appearance maintenance. No passions or dreams or even strong opinions. She was like a perfectly decorated empty room, beautiful to look at but soulless underneath. Charles threw himself into work even more intensely than before. Matthews Analytics was expanding globally, which meant endless travel and late nights at the office. He told himself he was building an empire, securing their future. But the truth was simpler. He was avoiding his own life. Margaret had moved back into her own apartment downtown 6 months after the wedding, claiming she wanted to give the newlyweds their privacy. But Charles suspected the real reason was that she'd accomplished her goal. He was married to the right kind of woman. The threat of Helene was permanently removed, and Margaret could rest easy knowing the family legacy was secure. Alice seemed to miss Margaret more than she missed Charles when he traveled. They spoke on the phone for hours, had lunch dates several times a week, went shopping together. Charles sometimes felt like a third wheel in his own marriage, as if Alice had married him primarily to solidify her bond with his mother. It was on a Tuesday evening in October, 2 years after his wedding, that Charles's carefully constructed life began to unravel. He'd come home early from a business dinner that had ended sooner than expected. Alice was at a charity gala that he begged off from, claiming fatigue. The penthouse was empty and quiet. He poured himself a bourbon and went into his study, intending to catch up on some reading. He'd been meaning to find his father's old real estate documents for weeks. There was a property in Connecticut that his father had purchased decades ago, and Charles's accountant needed the deed for tax purposes. He remembered his father keeping such documents in a filing cabinet in the study. The cabinet was packed with years of paperwork, most of it disorganized. Charles began pulling out folders, creating piles on the floor, documents he needed, documents he could shred, documents that needed to be sorted later. At the very back of the bottom drawer, behind hanging folders full of old utility bills, his hand hit something solid. He pulled out a cardboard box, unmarked and sealed with tape that had yellowed with age. Charles didn't remember seeing this box before. He grabbed his keys and used one to slice through the tape, opening the flaps. Inside were backup drives, a dozen of them each labeled with dates. Security system backups from 3 years ago, from before he'd upgraded the system. He'd completely forgotten about these. When the new system was installed, the old drives had been disconnected but not discarded, just packed away and forgotten in the chaos of that time. Charles almost closed the box and set it aside. He needed to find property documents, not old security footage. But something made him pause. One of the drives was labeled with a date range that included September 14th, the day Helene had been arrested. His lawyers had told him there was no footage from that day. They'd said the system had malfunctioned. But here was a backup drive that should contain footage from that exact time period. Charles set down his bourbon carefully. His hands were trembling slightly as he pulled out the drive labeled with September's dates. It was an old model, but his computer should still have the right ports to read it. He connected it to his laptop and opened the folder structure. There were hundreds of video files organized by date and camera location. He navigated to September 14th and found files from all the cameras in the apartment, including the one in the living room. For a long moment, Charles just stared at the file. Did he really want to watch this? The trial was over. Helene had been convicted. She'd already served 2 years of her sentence. What good would come from dredging this up again? But the doubts that had plagued him since that day, the ones he'd tried so hard to suppress, came rushing back with overwhelming force. Her face, her desperation, her insistence that she was telling the truth. Charles clicked on the file. The video opened with a wide shot of the living room from a camera mounted in the corner near the ceiling. The timestamp read 6:30 p.m. The room was empty. At 6:37, Margaret entered the frame. She walked normally, with no sign of the back pain she'd claimed to have been suffering. In fact, she moved with complete ease, checking her watch and looking toward the hallway expectantly. Charles leaned closer to the screen. At 6:39, Helene entered from the direction of the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel. Margaret approached her, and even without audio, Charles could see they were having a conversation. Margaret's body language was casual, friendly. She pointed to the Persian rug in the center of the room, then gestured to her own back. Helene's expression showed confusion, then concern. She shook her head. Margaret continued talking. Her hand pressed dramatically to her lower back now, her face showing an exaggerated expression of pain. But Charles could see what the angle of the camera revealed. When Margaret thought Helene wasn't looking directly at her, her face was completely normal. No pain at all. It was an act. Helene shook her head again, clearly uncomfortable with whatever Margaret was suggesting. But Margaret kept talking, kept insisting. Finally, reluctantly, Helene nodded. Margaret lay down on the rug, face down. She checked her watch one more time before placing her head on her arms. Helene stood beside her, still hesitant. Then, with visible reluctance, she carefully placed one foot on Margaret's back, then the other, distributing her weight cautiously. Charles's stomach turned. He watched Helene wobble slightly, trying to maintain balance, clearly trying to be as gentle as possible. Margaret lay still for a moment. Then, at 6:45 exactly, she checked her watch one final time. And then she began to struggle. She began to cry out, her arms flailing. But here was the thing Charles could see that he couldn't have seen from the doorway. There was a split second before she started struggling where Margaret's face was visible to the camera. And on that face was a look of cold satisfaction, of triumph, before she replaced it with an expression of fear and pain. She'd timed it perfectly. She'd waited until the exact moment Charles would be walking through the door to begin her performance. Helene immediately tried to step off, confusion and panic clear on her face. She got one foot down, but Margaret reached back and grabbed Helene's ankle, holding her in place for a few more critical seconds while she continued to scream. That's when Charles himself entered the frame. He watched himself react with rage, rushing to his mother's side. He watched Helene's desperate attempts to explain, the genuine shock and fear on her face. He watched his mother's Oscar-worthy performance, the tears, the trembling, the accusations, and he watched himself destroy an innocent woman's life. The video continued for a few more minutes, showing the arrival of police and paramedics. But Charles had stopped it. He sat back in his chair, his hands over his face, a sound escaping his throat that was half sob, half scream. What had he done? What in God's name had he done? He reopened the video and watched it again. Then a third time. Each viewing made it more undeniable. This had been a setup. His mother had deliberately orchestrated this entire thing. She'd manipulated Helene into a situation that would look damning, timed it perfectly, and then lied under oath to destroy her. But why? Why would his mother do something so monstrous? Charles sat in his study for over an hour, the question spinning through his mind. And then, slowly, pieces began to fall into place. His mother's comments about Helene over those last few weeks before the arrest. Her observations about how much time Charles was spending at home. Her concerns about Charles becoming too attached to the help. His mother had seen something between him and Helene, or thought she'd seen it, and she'd decided to eliminate what she perceived as a threat. A threat to what? To the family's social standing? To her control over her son? To her idea of who Charles should be with? Charles thought about Alice. The way his mother had pushed them together so quickly after Helene's arrest. The way she'd orchestrated their courtship with such precision. Alice, who was from the right family, the right background, the right social circle. His door opened. Charles looked up to see Alice standing in the doorway, home from her gala. She'd removed her jewelry but still wore her evening gown. "You're home," she said, surprise in her voice. "I thought you'd be asleep by now." Charles looked at his wife, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time, and he saw it, something in her eyes, a flicker of calculation, of wariness. She saw the security drive still connected to his laptop. Her eyes moved to the paused video on the screen. "What are you watching?" she asked, but her tone had changed. It was careful now. "How long have you known?" Charles asked quietly. Alice didn't bother to pretend she didn't understand. She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. "About what?" "About my mother setting Helene up. About the fact that it was all lies." A long pause. Then Alice moved to the bar cart and poured herself a vodka martini with steady hands. "I've known from the beginning. I was here that day, hiding in the guest room. I was supposed to be a witness if needed, though thankfully it wasn't necessary." The casual way she said it, the complete lack of remorse, hit Charles like a physical blow. "You've known for 2 years that an innocent woman was in prison and you said nothing?" Alice took a sip of her drink. "She wasn't innocent, Charles. She overstepped. She was getting ideas above her station. Your mother saw it, I saw it. Something had to be done." "Ideas above her station?" Charles's voice rose. "She was kind to my mother. She did her job well. She was a good person." "She was the help," Alice said coldly. "And she was falling in love with you, and you were falling for her. Don't deny it. We both saw it. You think I wanted to marry a man who was mooning over his maid? Your mother did what needed to be done to protect you from making a terrible mistake. Charles stood up so fast his chair tipped backward. Get out. Excuse me. Get out of my study. Get out of this apartment. Get out of my life. Alice's composure cracked slightly. You can't be serious. You're going to throw away our marriage over that woman? Over someone you barely knew? Someone who's been in prison for 2 years. I'm throwing away our marriage because I'm married to someone who helped frame an innocent person for a crime she didn't commit. Someone who lied for 2 years. Someone who... Charles's voice broke. Someone who has no soul. Your mother. I'll deal with my mother. Right now, I'm dealing with you. I want you out. Tonight. We'll figure out the legal details tomorrow. But I want you gone. Alice's face hardened. Fine. But don't think this will be easy. I'll take you for everything I can in the divorce. Your mother and I will both testify to Helene's instability, her manipulation. You'll lose more than just money if you try to reopen this case. I don't care, Charles said simply. I don't care about the money. I don't care about the scandal. An innocent woman has been in prison for 2 years because of lies my mother told and you corroborated. I will spend every resource I have to make that right. You're a fool, Alice said, draining her martini. That woman was nothing. She is nothing. And you're willing to destroy your life for her. No, Charles said quietly. I'm willing to destroy my life to stop being the kind of person who lets innocent people suffer so I can maintain my comfort. Now get out. Alice stared at him for a long moment, then laughed bitterly. Your mother was wrong about you. You're not worth protecting after all. She left the room. Charles heard her moving through the apartment, packing the essentials. 20 minutes later, he heard the front door slam. Charles sat back down at his desk. The video was still paused on the screen, frozen on Helene's face, on the moment of her confusion and fear. 2 years. She'd been in prison for 2 years for a crime she didn't commit, while he'd been living his life, getting married, pretending everything was fine. He picked up his phone and started making calls. First to his lawyer, rousing him from sleep with an urgency that couldn't wait until morning. Then to a private investigator. Then to the best criminal defense attorney in New York, the kind that charged $1,000 an hour and was worth every penny. Then he called his mother. Charles? It's late. Is everything all right? I found the security footage, he said without preamble. From the day Helene was arrested. A long silence. Then, I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. I saw everything, Mom. I saw you fake your pain. I saw you convince Helene to help you. I saw you time it perfectly for my arrival. I saw you grab her ankle to hold her in place. I saw everything. Charles, whatever you think you saw, don't lie to me anymore. I need to know why. Why would you do something so cruel to someone who only ever showed you kindness? Margaret's voice hardened. She wasn't right for you. Right for me? What does that even mean? You were developing feelings for her, Charles. I could see it. Every day you came home earlier, you smiled more. You looked at her with affection. She was going to ruin everything. You needed to be with someone from our world. Someone appropriate. Someone like Alice. Alice knew, Charles said flatly. She helped you. Of course she did. She understood what was at stake. She understood the importance of maintaining standards, of protecting the family reputation. An innocent woman has been in prison for 2 years because of your standards, Charles said, his voice shaking with rage. You lied under oath. You sent someone to prison. Do you understand what you've done? I protected my son from making a mistake that would have humiliated our entire family. Your son is ashamed to be related to you, Charles said. "Don't call me. Don't come to this apartment. I'm filing for divorce from Alice, and I'm spending every resource I have to free Helene and clear her name. And when I do, I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you did. Charles, if you do this, you'll destroy yourself too. The scandal, the publicity. I don't care. Goodbye, Mother." He hung up while she was still talking. Charles sat alone in his study until dawn, watching the security footage again and again, memorizing every detail. This was the evidence that would free Helene. This was the truth that had been hidden for 2 years. But the truth came with a devastating cost. He'd have to admit that he'd been wrong, that he'd sent an innocent woman to prison, that he'd been so blinded by his anger and his trust in his mother that he'd ignored all the signs that something wasn't right. He'd have to face Helene and admit what he'd done to her. He'd have to look into the eyes of a woman whose life he'd destroyed and ask for forgiveness that he had no right to expect. As the sun rose over Manhattan, Charles began the process of dismantling his old life and facing the consequences of his willful blindness. It would be a long road, filled with legal battles and public humiliation and personal reckoning. But for the first time in 2 years, Charles Matthews felt like he might actually be doing something right. There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after. Moments when the truth crashes through all our comfortable lies and forces us to face who we really are. These moments are painful, devastating even, but they're also necessary. They're the moments that test whether we have the courage to make things right, no matter the cost to ourselves. This is where the real story begins, not in the easy choices, but in the hard ones. Stay with us, because what comes next will test everyone involved in ways they never imagined. Charles didn't sleep that night. As dawn broke over Manhattan, painting the penthouse in shades of orange and gold, he sat at his kitchen table with his laptop, a legal pad filled with notes, and a phone that he'd been using to leave voicemails and send emails to lawyers since 4 a.m. The security footage had been copied to 3 separate drives, uploaded to secure cloud storage, and sent to his attorney. Charles wasn't taking any chances that this evidence might disappear. At 7:30 a.m., he heard a key in the lock. For a moment, he thought Alice might have returned, but then Margaret walked in, still wearing her evening clothes from whatever event she'd attended the night before. "We need to talk," she said, her voice tight. "I told you not to come here. I'm still your mother, Charles. You can't just shut me out." Margaret moved into the kitchen, her heels clicking on the marble floor. In the morning light, she looked older than her 74 years, her makeup smudged and her expression haggard. "Can't I?" Charles stood up, keeping the kitchen island between them. "You committed perjury. You destroyed an innocent woman's life. You manipulated me into sending her to prison. What part of that makes you think you have the right to be here?" Margaret's face flushed. "I did what any mother would do. I protected you. Protected me from what exactly? From being happy, from having genuine human connection, from being with someone who actually cared about me instead of my money, from being with someone completely inappropriate." Margaret's voice rose, her careful composure cracking. "Charles, please try to understand. That woman, Helene, she was the help. She came from nothing. She had a child out of wedlock. She was barely educated. You are Charles Matthews. You're worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You come from a distinguished family. You have responsibilities, standards to maintain." Charles shook his head in disgust. "Listen to yourself. Do you even hear what you're saying? You sound like something out of the 19th century. I sound like someone who understands how the world actually works." Margaret shot back. "Your father understood this too. He built his business by maintaining the right connections, the right relationships. He married me because I came from the right family. That's how dynasties are built and maintained. Dad married you because he loved you, Charles said. But even as he said it, he wondered if it was true. Had his father's marriage been another strategic move? Margaret softened slightly. He came to love me, yes, but initially it was practical. And we built something wonderful together. That's what I wanted for you. Alice comes from our world. She understands the demands of your position. She would have been the perfect partner for you. Alice helped you frame an innocent woman for a crime she didn't commit, Charles said flatly. That's not perfect. That's sociopathic. Margaret waved her hand dismissively. Alice understood what needed to be done. She was practical. Unlike you, apparently. Practical? You call sending someone to prison for 2 years practical. I call removing an obstacle practical. Charles, you weren't thinking clearly. I saw you with that woman. You came home early just to see her. You lit up when she smiled at you. You were falling for someone completely beneath you. And if I hadn't acted, you would have humiliated yourself and this family. Charles felt something snap inside him. Helene Washington was not beneath me. If anything, she was better than all of us. She worked hard. She cared for you with genuine kindness. She was trying to build a better life for her daughter. She had more integrity in her little finger than you and Alice combined. She was a single mother working as a maid, Margaret said coldly. That's not integrity. That's desperation. Get out, Charles said quietly. What? I said get out. Get out of my home. You're not welcome here anymore. Margaret's face went white. You can't mean that. I'm your mother. You're someone who committed a crime and destroyed an innocent person's life to maintain your outdated sense of social hierarchy. The fact that you gave birth to me doesn't excuse that. Charles, please, let's talk about this rationally. Yes, I made some choices that in retrospect might have been extreme, but I did it out of love. Everything I've ever done has been to protect you, to secure your future. You did it out of control, Charles said. You couldn't stand that I was developing feelings for someone you hadn't chosen for me. You couldn't stand that I might actually be happy with someone you deemed inappropriate. This wasn't about protecting me. This was about you maintaining control over my life. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Real ones this time. Is that really what you think of me? That I'm some controlling monster? I think you're someone who hurt a good person because she didn't fit your narrow definition of who belongs in our world. And yes, I think you're controlling. I think you've been controlling my entire life, and I was too blind to see it until now. Everything I've done for you, Margaret whispered. Then stop. Stop doing things for me. Stop trying to protect me. Stop trying to control who I can care about. I'm 38 years old, and I'm done living my life according to your rules. Margaret straightened, her tears disappearing as quickly as they'd appeared. When she spoke again, her voice was ice cold. If you proceed with this, if you try to reopen Helene's case, you'll destroy yourself too. The media will have a field day. Your business will suffer. Your reputation will be ruined. Is that really what you want? All for a woman who probably doesn't even remember you. She remembers me, Charles said quietly. She remembers that I didn't believe her, that I sent her to prison, that I didn't even give her the benefit of the doubt. If I spend the rest of my life trying to make that right, it still won't be enough. You're a fool, Margaret said, echoing Alice's words from the night before. Maybe, but I'd rather be a fool who tried to do the right thing than someone who lives comfortably with lies. Margaret grabbed her purse from the counter. When this blows up in your face, don't come crying to me. I won't, Charles promised. She walked to the door, then paused and looked back. You know what the worst part is? I actually liked that girl, Helene. Before I realized what was happening, I genuinely enjoyed her company. She was kind to me when she didn't have to be. She made me laugh. She reminded me of better days. Then why? Charles asked, genuinely baffled. If you liked her, why did you do this to her? Margaret's face crumpled slightly. Because I was afraid. I was afraid of losing you the way I lost your father. I was afraid of being alone. I was afraid that if you fell in love with her, you wouldn't need me anymore. And I couldn't bear that. It was perhaps the most honest thing his mother had said in years. Charles felt a flicker of something that might have been understanding, but it was overwhelmed by everything else, by the magnitude of what she'd done, by the price that Helene had paid for Margaret's fear. You lost me anyway, Charles said softly. The moment you did this, you lost me. Margaret nodded once, her composure back in place. I suppose I did. Goodbye, Charles. She left without another word. Charles listened to her footsteps fading, the elevator doors opening and closing. Then the penthouse was silent. He sat back down at the kitchen table and pulled up his email. His attorney had responded, confirming he'd received the footage and was already drafting the necessary legal motions. The criminal defense attorney had agreed to take Helene's case. The private investigator was ready to dig into everything about the original trial. The wheels were in motion, but Charles knew the road ahead would be long and brutal. The legal system didn't like admitting it had been wrong. Prosecutors hated overturning convictions. And Margaret and Alice would fight this with everything they had. His phone buzzed. A text from his CFO. Board meeting this afternoon. There are rumors about you and Alice separating. We need to discuss. Charles typed back. More than rumors. Divorce filing this week. Prepare for media coverage. We'll handle it. Another text, this one from a business associate. Heard your mother was at your place early this morning. Everything okay? News traveled fast in their world. By nightfall, speculation would be running rampant. By tomorrow, the tabloids would have the story. By next week, everyone would know that Charles Matthews's seemingly perfect life was imploding. Charles thought about calling in sick, hiding in his apartment, avoiding the inevitable fallout. But hiding wouldn't help Helene. It wouldn't get her out of prison any faster. He showered, dressed in one of his favorite suits, and headed to his office. When his assistant saw him, she did a double take. Mr. Matthews, are you feeling all right? I didn't sleep, he admitted. Long night. Can you schedule a meeting with our PR team for this afternoon? Before the board meeting. Of course. Sir, if you don't mind me asking, is everything okay? Charles paused. No, but it will be. Eventually. He spent the morning in back-to-back meetings, forcing himself to focus on business even though his mind kept drifting to Helene. Where was she right now? What was her daily life like in prison? Did she hate him? She had every right to. The PR meeting was difficult. Charles explained in broad strokes that he was divorcing Alice and that there might be some legal complications that would attract media attention. The PR team, accustomed to managing crises for their clients, took notes and began strategizing. The board meeting was worse. His board members, all men and women from the same wealthy circles he'd grown up in, looked at him with barely concealed concern. Divorce was common in their world, but it was usually handled quietly, discreetly. Whatever was happening with Charles had all the hallmarks of becoming very public and very messy. Charles, his board chair said carefully, we need to know if any of this will impact the company. We have a responsibility to our shareholders. I understand, Charles said, and I'll be transparent with you. I'm in the process of addressing a serious injustice that involves my mother and my soon-to-be ex-wife. It's going to be public, it's going to be ugly, and yes, it will probably impact the company in the short term. But I'm asking you to trust me. This is something I have to do. What kind of injustice? One board member asked. Charles took a deep breath. 2 years ago, someone who worked for me was falsely accused of a crime and sent to prison. I've discovered evidence that proves her innocence, and I'm working to free her and clear her name. The people who framed her were my mother and my wife. That's why I'm divorcing Alice and why I've cut off contact with my mother. The room fell silent. Finally, the board chair spoke. That's quite serious, Charles. I know, and I know the company will take a hit. But I'd rather lose business than let an innocent woman stay in prison. The board exchanged glances. Charles could see them calculating, weighing the financial implications against the optics, considering whether they needed to force him to step down as CEO. Then the board chair surprised him. Do what you need to do. We'll weather the storm. But Charles, be prepared. This is going to get very ugly before it gets better. I know, Charles said again. Thank you. As he left the building that evening, Charles's phone buzzed with a text from his attorney. Motion filed for appeal and new trial based on newly discovered evidence. Media will have it by morning. Brace yourself. Charles stood on the sidewalk, watching people rush past him in the autumn twilight. Somewhere, 200 miles away in a prison facility, Helene had no idea that her life was about to change again. For 2 years, she'd survived in an impossible situation. And now she was about to be dragged through it all over again, the trial, the media coverage, the scrutiny. But this time, Charles would make sure the truth came out, no matter what it cost him. He hailed a cab and gave the driver his address, preparing himself for another sleepless night in the empty penthouse. Alice's things were still scattered around the apartment, her clothes in the closet, her toiletries in the bathroom. He'd have to have someone pack them up and ship them wherever she was staying. As the cab inched through Manhattan traffic, Charles allowed himself to think about what he'd do if he actually managed to free Helene. What would he say to her? How could he possibly apologize for what he'd done? Sorry, I ruined 2 years of your life because I believed my mother's lies didn't quite cover it. The truth was, he had no idea what came next. He just knew that for the first time in 2 years, he was finally doing what he should have done from the beginning. Fighting for the truth, no matter where it led. Even if it led to the complete destruction of everything he'd built. Even if it meant facing the full weight of his own guilt and shame. Even if Helene, once freed, wanted nothing to do with him ever again. It was the right thing to do, and Charles was done taking the easy path. The headline in the New York Post the next morning was exactly as sensational as Charles had anticipated. Tech mogul's mum framed Maid, Matthews files to free woman imprisoned 2 years. By 9 a.m., his phone was ringing nonstop. Business associates, old friends, distant relatives, all calling with the same mixture of concern and curiosity. Charles ignored most of them. He had more important things to do. At 10 a.m., he sat in the office of Janet Morrison, one of the most respected criminal defense attorneys in New York. Her office was in a nondescript building in Midtown, nothing like the gleaming towers where corporate lawyers worked, but her reputation was formidable. She'd freed 7 wrongly convicted people in the past decade. I've reviewed the security footage, Janet said, her salt and pepper hair pulled back in a practical bun, her sharp eyes fixed on Charles. It's damning. Your mother clearly orchestrated the entire thing. Can we get Helene out immediately? Charles asked. Some kind of emergency release? Janet shook her head. The legal system doesn't move that fast, especially for something like this. We need to file for a new trial based on newly discovered evidence. The prosecutor's office will fight it. They don't like admitting they got it wrong. This is going to be a process. How long? Months if we're lucky. Could be over a year if they really dig in. Charles felt his chest tighten. More months. Potentially another year of Helene sitting in prison for a crime she didn't commit. That's not acceptable. I understand your frustration, Mr. Matthews, but that's the reality. The law has procedures and we have to follow them. However, I will say this, your evidence is strong. We have a real shot at not just getting a new trial, but getting the charges dismissed entirely. What do I need to do? Let me handle the legal strategy. What I need from you is to be prepared for what's coming. Your mother and your wife will have their own attorneys, and they're going to come at this hard. They'll claim the footage has been doctored. They'll question your motives. They'll try to paint you as someone having a breakdown who's rewriting history. Are you prepared for that? Yes, Charles said without hesitation. They'll also dig into your relationship with Helene. They'll try to prove you had an affair with her, that you're doing this out of guilt or misplaced affection or to cover up some other crime. Every aspect of your life will be scrutinized. I don't care. I just want her free. Janet studied him for a long moment. Mr. Matthews, I've been doing this for 25 years. I've seen a lot of people try to make amends for wrongs they've committed. Most of them give up when things get hard. Are you going to give up? No. Even if it costs you your company? Even then. Even if it costs you your reputation? Even then. Even if, at the end of all this, Ms. Washington wants nothing to do with you? Charles felt that question like a knife between his ribs. But he nodded. Even then, this isn't about me getting something out of it. It's about doing what's right. Janet smiled slightly. Good, because that's the only way we're going to get through this. Now, I need to meet with Ms. Washington. I've already contacted the facility where she's being held. We have a meeting scheduled for tomorrow. Would you like to come? Charles's first instinct was to say yes. He desperately wanted to see Helene, to apologize, to explain. But then he thought about what it would be like for her, seeing him walk into that prison visiting room after everything he'd done to her. No, he said quietly. Not yet. She needs to hear from you first. She needs to understand what's happening and what her options are. She shouldn't have to see me until she's ready. That's mature of you, Janet said. I'll go alone tomorrow. I'll explain everything, show her the footage, and walk her through what comes next. Then we'll figure out timing for you two to meet. After leaving Janet's office, Charles went to visit another lawyer. This one a divorce attorney named Patricia Chun who came highly recommended. She listened to Charles's situation without visible reaction, taking notes on her tablet. Your wife knew about the false accusation and helped facilitate it, Patricia said, confirming. That significantly strengthens your position in the divorce. She's unlikely to get much beyond what she came into the marriage with. I don't care about the money, Charles said. I just want it done quickly and completely. She's not going to make it easy. According to my research, Alice has already retained Marcus Weinstein. He's aggressive and expensive. So are you, Charles pointed out. Patricia smiled. True. All right, Mr. Matthews. We'll file this week. Expect Alice to fight for alimony, for a substantial property settlement, for everything she can get. She'll probably also try to use your involvement in overturning the conviction against you, paint you as unstable. Let her try. Over the following days, Charles's life became a whirlwind of legal meetings, media management, and business damage control. The story had exploded across news outlets. Some took a sympathetic angle, portraying Charles as a man trying to right a terrible wrong. Others were more skeptical, questioning his motives and suggesting this was an elaborate publicity stunt or the result of a mental breakdown. The tabloids were having a field day. They dug up photos of Helene from before her arrest, analyzed them for signs of her supposed criminal nature. They interviewed people who claimed to know her, though most were strangers inventing stories for money. They published unflattering photos of Charles, catching him looking exhausted and stressed. His company's stock took a hit. Not catastrophic, but enough that the board called another emergency meeting. Some of his largest clients were reconsidering their contracts, concerned about the negative publicity. Charles handled it all with a numb determination. None of it mattered compared to freeing Helene. 2 days after their initial meeting, Janet Morrison drove upstate to the women's correctional facility where Helene was being held. The facility was a sprawling complex of gray concrete and chain-link fences topped with razor wire, surrounded by empty fields. Inside, Janet was processed through security, her briefcase searched, her ID checked multiple times. Finally, she was led to a visiting room, a space painted in institutional beige with plastic tables and chairs bolted to the floor. Helene Washington was brought in by a guard. Janet had seen her mugshot and photos from before the arrest, but she was still struck by how much the woman had changed. Helene was thinner, her face harder, her eyes carrying a wariness that hadn't been there before. Prison had aged her beyond her 28 years. Ms. Washington, I'm Janet Morrison. I'm an attorney, and I'm here because I've been hired to represent you. Helene sat down slowly, suspicion clear on her face. I didn't hire anyone. I can't afford anyone. You didn't hire me. Charles Matthews did. The reaction was immediate. Helene's face went through a rapid series of emotions. Shock, anger, confusion, hurt. No, she said flatly. I don't want anything from him. Ms. Washington, please listen to what I have to say. Then, if you still want me to leave, I will. Helene crossed her arms but nodded. Janet opened her briefcase and pulled out a tablet. 2 days ago, Charles Matthews was searching for documents in his home office. He found old security system backup drives that he'd forgotten about. These drives contain footage from the day you were arrested. She turned the tablet around, showing Helene the paused video. This footage shows exactly what happened that day. It shows that you're innocent. It shows that Margaret Matthews deliberately set you up. Helene stared at the screen. Her hands were shaking. Show me. Janet played the footage. She watched Helene's face as the woman saw herself on that screen, saw the setup unfold, saw the truth captured in digital clarity. Tears streamed down Helene's face, but she didn't make a sound. When the video ended, Helene was silent for a long moment. Then he knew. He knew his security system doesn't malfunction. He knew there should have been footage. Why didn't he check? It was a fair question, one that Janet couldn't fully answer. He trusted his mother. He believed what his lawyers told him about the system malfunctioning. He made a terrible mistake. A mistake that cost me 2 years of my life, Helene said, her voice hard. 2 years away from my daughter. 2 years in this place. 2 years of everyone thinking I'm someone who would hurt an elderly woman. You're right, Janet said simply. What happened to you is unforgivable. No apology will ever be enough. But the question now is, what do you want to do moving forward? What are my options? We file for a new trial based on this newly discovered evidence. With this footage, we have a strong case for getting the charges dismissed entirely. You could be out in a matter of months. Months? Helene repeated hollowly. More months in here. I wish I could promise it would be faster, but the legal system has procedures we have to follow. However, I'm very good at my job, and I will fight for you with everything I have. Helene looked at the frozen image on the tablet screen, at herself caught in that moment of confusion and betrayal. Why is he doing this, Charles? Why now? He said it's because it's the right thing to do. He said he needs to make this right, regardless of what it costs him personally. What's it costing him? His marriage is ending. His relationship with his mother is destroyed. His company is taking a financial hit. The media is eviscerating him. He's becoming a pariah in his social circles. Janet paused. But he told me he doesn't care about any of that. He just wants you free. Helene closed her eyes. I don't know if I can forgive him. You don't have to, Janet said gently. Forgiveness is yours to give or withhold. All I'm asking is whether you want me to fight for your freedom. Of course I want that, Helene said, opening her eyes. But I need to know, is this real? Or is this just him trying to ease his guilty conscience? Because if this is some game, if there's a chance this could fall apart and I could end up back here, I need to know now. Ms. Washington, I've been practicing law for 25 years. I've seen every kind of client there is. Charles Matthews is many things, most of them not very flattering right now, but he's sincere about this. He's willing to sacrifice everything to make this right. Whether that's enough is for you to decide, but his commitment is real. Helene nodded slowly. Okay, do it. Get me out of here. I will, Janet promised. Now I need to prepare you for what's coming. This is going to get media attention, a lot of it. Your name and face are going to be everywhere again. Are you ready for that? I've been ready for 2 years, Helene said with a strength that surprised even her. Let's bring them all down. Justice isn't a moment. It's a journey, often a long and painful one that tests everyone involved. When you see someone fighting for what's right, even when it's hard, even when they have to face their own failures, that's when you witness real courage. If this story is resonating with you, if you've ever had to fight for justice or truth in your own life, you're not alone. These stories matter because they remind us that it's never too late to do the right thing. Where are you watching from? Have you ever had to fight to make something right? Share your thoughts and your location in the comments below. We read every single one, and your stories inspire us to keep telling these important stories. The legal battle that ensued was unlike anything Charles had experienced in his carefully curated life. It was messy, public, and brutal in ways that no amount of money could fully shield him from. Alice fought the divorce with vicious determination. Her attorney painted Charles as someone having a mental breakdown, obsessed with an ex-employee, possibly suffering from delusions. They requested psychiatric evaluations. They subpoenaed his medical records. They tried to gain control of his finances by arguing he was incompetent to manage his affairs. Margaret, meanwhile, hired a team of attorneys who immediately went on the offensive. They claimed the security footage had been doctored, that Charles had fabricated it to cover up an affair with Helene. They filed motions to prevent the footage from being used as evidence, arguing it was obtained illegally. The media coverage intensified. Every day brought new headlines, new analysis, new speculation. Charles found himself photographed everywhere he went. His every expression analyzed for signs of instability or guilt. His company's board, despite their initial support, began to waver. 3 major clients pulled their contracts. The stock dropped another 15%. There were quiet discussions about whether Charles should step down as CEO, at least temporarily, until the situation resolved itself. Charles refused. He'd built this company from nothing, and he wasn't going to abandon it now. Instead, he worked twice as hard, putting in 18-hour days to prove he was still capable of running his business while fighting for Helene's freedom. The first hearing for Helene's appeal took place on a cold January morning, 3 months after Charles had discovered the footage. The courtroom was packed with media, curious onlookers, and supporters from both sides. Helene was brought in wearing prison clothes, her hands cuffed in front of her. She looked thinner than ever, her face drawn, but there was a quiet dignity in the way she held herself. When her eyes met Charles's across the courtroom, the look she gave him was complex, acknowledgement, hurt, something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Charles wanted to speak to her to apologize, but Janet had advised against it. "Let the legal process play out first," she'd said. "There'll be time for personal conversations later." The hearing was procedural arguments about whether the newly discovered evidence warranted a new trial. The prosecutor, a woman named Claire Henderson who'd originally convicted Helene, fought hard against it. She argued that the footage didn't prove Helene's innocence, only that Margaret had asked her to stand on her back. She argued that Helene still should have known better, that the original verdict should stand. Janet countered with forensic expert testimony about the footage's authenticity, about the clear evidence of Margaret's manipulation and deceit. She pointed out that Helene had acted in good faith, trying to help someone she believed was in pain. Judge Robert Torres, a stern-faced man in his 60s who'd been on the bench for 30 years, listened to both sides with an impassive expression. At the end of the hearing, he announced he would issue his decision within 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks felt like years. Charles found himself unable to focus on anything else. He played out every possible scenario in his mind. What if the judge denied the appeal? What if Helene had to serve out her full sentence? What if all of this was for nothing? On a Wednesday afternoon, Janet called him. Judge Torres issued his ruling. He's granting a new trial. He also ordered Helene's immediate release on her own recognizance pending the trial. Charles felt his knees go weak. "She's getting out?" "Yes, today. I'm heading to the facility now to process her release." Can I be there?" Janet paused. "Let me ask her. I'll call you back." 10 minutes later, Janet called again. She said yes. "Meet me at the facility in 2 hours." Charles drove upstate with his heart pounding. He'd thought about this moment constantly over the past 3 months, what he would say, how he would apologize. But now that it was actually happening, he had no idea what words could possibly be adequate. He arrived at the facility before Janet. He waited in the parking lot, watching the entrance, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. Janet's car pulled up. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the main door opened and Helene walked out. She was wearing the same clothes she'd been arrested in 2 years earlier, jeans and a simple shirt that now hung loose on her thinner frame. She carried a clear plastic bag with her few personal belongings. She looked around at the free world like someone who couldn't quite believe it was real. Charles got out of his car. Helene saw him and stopped walking. For a long moment, they just looked at each other across the parking lot. Then Charles walked toward her, stopping a respectful distance away. "Helene, I don't know what to say. I'm sorry is inadequate. I'm sorry doesn't cover what I did to you, but I am sorry. I'm more sorry than I can ever express." Helene's eyes were dry, but her voice shook when she spoke. "You believed your mother over me, without question, without hesitation. You didn't even consider that I might be telling the truth. I know, you're right. I failed you completely. You did more than fail me. You destroyed my life. 2 years, Mr. Matthews. 2 years of my life. Do you know what it's like in there? Do you have any idea what I went through?" Charles shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "No, I don't. And I hate myself for putting you there." "My daughter," Helene's voice broke. "She was 7 when I went in. She's 9 now. She's grown up thinking her mother is a criminal. She's been bullied at school. She's had nightmares. My mother's been raising her, and I'm grateful for that, but I should have been there. I should have been the one tucking her in at night, helping her with homework, kissing her scraped knees. You took that from me. I know. God, I know. If I could trade places with you, if I could give you those 2 years back, I would do anything." "You can't give them back," Helene said, her voice hard. "They're gone. Forever." Janet stood to the side, letting them have this moment. She'd seen confrontations like this before, the collision of victim and perpetrator, of guilt and anger. "Why did you do this?" Helene asked. "Why did you fight for me after all this time?" "Because I found the truth. And once I knew the truth, I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to make it right." "Is this about your guilt? Is this to make yourself feel better?" Charles thought about lying, about making it sound more noble than it was. But Helene deserved honesty. "Partly, yes. I am consumed with guilt. But it's also because it's the right thing to do, regardless of how I feel. You were innocent. You are innocent. And you deserve to have your life back." "I can't ever get my life back," Helene said. "Not the one I had. That's gone." "I know. But maybe you can build something new, something better. And I will do whatever I can to help with that, if you'll let me. If not, I understand. But please know that I will spend the rest of my life trying to make this right." Helene looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned to Janet. "What happens now?" "Now we prepare for your new trial," Janet said. "But honestly, with the evidence we have, I expect the prosecution will drop the charges entirely. They don't want to go to trial with this. And if they don't drop them, then we go to trial and we win. I promise you, Helene, you're never going back to that place." Helene nodded slowly. Then she looked back at Charles. "I need time. I need time to process all of this, to be with my daughter, to figure out who I am after everything that happened. I can't deal with you right now." "I understand," Charles said quickly. "Take all the time you need. There's no pressure. I'm glad you're free. That's all that matters." "There's one more thing," Janet said. "Helene, you have grounds for a substantial civil lawsuit against Margaret Matthews and Alice Matthews. False imprisonment, defamation, emotional distress. We could pursue damages in the tens of millions." Helene's eyes widened. "Millions?" "Yes. What they did to you was not just morally wrong but legally actionable. You could be financially set for life." "I'll need to think about that," Helene said. "Of course. We have time." Helene picked up her plastic bag of belongings. "I need to go. My mother's expecting me. She's driving up with Jasmine." "Do you need a ride?" Charles asked. If you wanted." "No," Helene said firmly. "No, I don't want your help with that. I'll wait here with Ms. Morrison." "Okay," Charles said, accepting the rejection he knew he deserved. "Okay, I'll go." He walked back to his car, feeling Helene's eyes on him the whole way. As he drove out of the parking lot, he looked in his rearview mirror and saw her standing there, a free woman for the first time in 2 years. It was a start. Not a good start, not a clean start, but a start nonetheless. Over the following weeks, the legal proceedings continued. Janet had been right. The prosecutor's office, faced with overwhelming evidence of Helene's innocence and Margaret's guilt, dropped all charges against Helene. The case was officially closed. Immediately, new charges were filed, but this time against Margaret Matthews and Alice Matthews. Perjury, conspiracy to commit fraud, false imprisonment. The list was extensive. Both women hired expensive legal teams to fight the charges, but the security footage was damning. Their attorneys advised them to accept plea deals. Margaret, after much legal wrangling, pleaded guilty to perjury and conspiracy. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison, though with her age and lack of prior criminal history, she'd likely serve only 18 months. Her attorney tried to paint her as a concerned mother who'd gone too far, but the judge was unsympathetic. "You destroyed an innocent woman's life to maintain your outdated sense of social hierarchy," Judge Torres said at her sentencing. "You abused the legal system and showed no remorse. You will serve every day of your sentence." Alice, meanwhile, fought harder. Her trial lasted 2 weeks, during which prosecutors laid out the conspiracy in detail. Alice maintained that she'd been manipulated by Margaret, that she hadn't known the full extent of the plan. But witness testimony and phone records told a different story. The jury found her guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 4 years. The civil lawsuit came next. Helene, after long discussions with her family and with Janet, decided to pursue damages. The lawsuit named both Margaret and Alice, as well as Charles's estate since the incident had occurred in his home and he'd employed Helene. Charles's attorneys advised him to fight it, to argue that he'd been deceived just like. Charles refused. "Settle," he told his attorneys. "Give her whatever she asks for. I'm not going to fight this." His legal team was baffled. "Mr. Matthews, you could significantly reduce your liability here. You were a victim of their deception too." "I was also the one who called the police," Charles said firmly. "I was the one who didn't believe her. I was the one who had the resources to investigate properly and didn't. I'm not fighting this. Work out a fair settlement." The settlement negotiations took 3 months. In the end, Helene received $15 million, split between Margaret's assets, which Charles had to cover since she couldn't pay, Alice's divorce settlement funds, and Charles's own contribution, $15 million. It was more money than Helene had ever imagined having. It was enough to secure her daughter's future, to build the life she'd always dreamed of, to never worry about money again. But it couldn't give her back the 2 years she'd lost. Couldn't erase the trauma. Couldn't undo the damage. Charles's divorce from Alice was finalized around the same time. She got virtually nothing beyond what she'd brought into the marriage. Her reputation was destroyed, her social standing obliterated. The same circles that had once welcomed her now wouldn't return her calls. Margaret, pending her prison sentence, moved to a small apartment outside the city. She tried to contact Charles several times, but he never responded. The relationship between mother and son was severed completely. Charles's company weathered the storm. The stock eventually recovered. Most of his clients returned once the dust settled. But Charles himself was forever changed. The man who'd once moved through life with easy confidence now carried a visible weight, a sadness in his eyes that never quite disappeared. He threw himself into philanthropy, specifically causes related to wrongful convictions and criminal justice reform. He donated millions to organizations that helped exonerees rebuild their lives. He used his platform to speak about the failures of the justice system. Some people said he was trying to buy redemption. Maybe they were right. But Charles knew that no amount of money or good deeds would ever truly balance the scales for what he'd done to Helene. 6 months after her release, Charles saw Helene for the second time. It was at a criminal justice reform gala that his foundation was sponsoring. Helene had been invited to speak about her experience as an exoneree. She walked onto the stage in a simple but elegant dress, her hair styled, looking more like the woman she'd been before prison but with a hardness in her eyes that would probably never fully fade. She spoke for 15 minutes about her experience, about the day she was arrested, about the trial, about prison life, about what it felt like to lose 2 years for a crime she didn't commit. Her voice was steady, powerful, controlled. "I was lucky," she said, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone. "I was lucky because eventually someone cared enough to find the truth. But there are thousands of people in prison right now who are innocent, who don't have anyone fighting for them, who don't have access to expensive lawyers or security footage that proves what really happened. We owe it to them to fix a system that allowed this to happen to me and continues to happen to others every single day." The applause was thunderous. People gave her a standing ovation. Charles stood in the back of the room, clapping until his hands hurt, tears streaming down his face. After her speech, people swarmed her with questions and congratulations. Charles waited until the crowd had thinned, then approached carefully. Helene, she turned, and for a moment, surprise flickered across her face. Charles, I didn't know you'd be here. It's my foundation's event, he said with a slight, sad smile. Your speech was incredible, powerful and important. Thank you. She studied him. You look tired. I am tired, he admitted. But that's not important. How are you? How's Jasmine? Helene's face softened at her daughter's name. She's good. She's doing better. We're in therapy together, working through everything. It's a process, but we're getting there. I'm glad. I'm so glad. An awkward silence fell between them. There was so much to say and no way to say it that would make any of it better. I wanted to thank you, Helene said finally, for fighting for me, for not giving up even when it would have been easier. You don't need to thank me. I was just doing what I should have done from the beginning. Still, took courage. I know what it cost you. It didn't cost me anything I wasn't willing to lose, Charles said. Helene, I know I have no right to ask this, but do you think you could forgive me? Helene was quiet for a long moment. I'm working on it. I'm working on forgiving a lot of people, including myself for being naive enough to trust your mother. Forgiveness is complicated. It's not a switch you flip. It's something you have to choose every day, and some days are harder than others. I understand, and I don't expect. I'm not asking for anything from you. I just want you to know that I think about what I did every single day. And I'm sorry. I will always be sorry. I know you are, Helene said softly. And that matters. It doesn't fix anything, but it matters. Someone called Helene's name from across the room, a reporter wanting an interview. I should go, she said. Of course. Take care of yourself, Helene. You too, Charles. She walked away, and Charles watched her go, feeling the same mixture of regret and relief he always felt in her presence. She was free. She was rebuilding her life. That had to be enough. Even if it meant he'd never have the chance to know her again. Even if it meant living with the guilt forever. It had to be enough. Time has a strange way of softening even the sharpest edges of pain. Not erasing them, but making them more bearable, more survivable. For Helene, the first year after her release was the hardest. Freedom, she discovered, didn't automatically mean healing. The trauma of prison had left marks that weren't visible but were no less real. Loud noises made her flinch. Confined spaces triggered panic attacks. She woke up most nights convinced she was still in her cell, her heart pounding until she remembered where she really was. But she was determined not to let what had happened define the rest of her life. She'd used part of her settlement money to buy a small house in Queens. Nothing extravagant, just a 3-bedroom home with a yard where Jasmine could play. It was the first home she'd ever owned, the first place that was truly theirs. Reuniting with Jasmine had been both beautiful and heartbreaking. Her daughter had been so small when Helene was arrested, just 7 years old. Now she was 9, on the cusp of becoming a different person, and Helene had missed so much of that transformation. Mommy, Jasmine had said on that first day, uncertain, as if she couldn't quite believe Helene was real. Yes, baby, it's me. I'm here now. I'm really here. They'd held each other and cried. And it had been the beginning of a long journey of rebuilding trust and connection. Therapy helped. They went together once a week, working through Jasmine's abandonment fears and Helene's guilt. Slowly, painfully, they found their way back to each other. Helene also started therapy on her own, processing everything she'd been through. Her therapist, Dr. Sarah Chun, was patient and insightful, helping Helene understand that healing wasn't linear, that it was okay to have bad days, that forgiveness, both of others and herself, was a process. "You carry a lot of anger," Dr. Chan observed during one session. "That's understandable and valid. But eventually, you'll need to decide whether you want to carry it forever or set it down." "I don't know how to set it down," Helene admitted. "Every time I think I'm past it, something reminds me of what happened and it all comes flooding back. That's normal. Trauma doesn't heal on a schedule. But I want you to think about something. What does your anger serve? Does it protect you? Does it keep you safe? Or does it keep you trapped?" The question haunted Helene. She realized that in some ways her anger was a comfort. It gave her something to hold on to, a clear villain to blame, a narrative that made sense. But it was also exhausting. It was like carrying a heavy stone everywhere she went. She started trying to imagine what it would feel like to set the stone down. The settlement money gave Helene the freedom to pursue dreams she'd put aside years ago. Her grandmother's bakery, the one she'd always fantasized about, could finally become a reality. She found a small commercial space in Astoria, Queens, in a neighborhood full of immigrants and working families, people who understood struggle and resilience. She spent months renovating it, painting the walls a warm yellow, installing commercial ovens, creating a space that felt welcoming and homey. Grandmother's Kitchen, she named it, a tribute to the woman who'd taught her that food could be an expression of love. Jasmine helped with the preparations, excited to have a project they could work on together. She drew pictures that Helene framed and hung on the walls. She helped test recipes, giving her serious 9-year-old opinions on which peach cobbler was best. The bakery opened on a sunny Saturday morning in May, a year and 3 months after Helene's release. The line stretched down the block, people drawn by word of mouth and a feature in a local food blog about Helene's story. That first day was chaotic and exhausting and perfect. Helene worked from 5 a.m. until closing at 8 p.m., baking batch after batch of sweet potato pies, peach cobblers, cornbread, and buttermilk biscuits. Every recipe was her grandmother's, made with the same love and care that she remembered from childhood. When the last customer left and she locked the door, Helene looked around at her bakery, her business, her dream made real, and she cried. But this time they were tears of joy. The business thrived. Within 6 months, Grandmother's Kitchen had become a neighborhood institution. People came not just for the incredible food, but for Helene herself. She had a gift for making people feel seen, for remembering their names and their stories, for creating a space that felt like home. She hired staff, mostly women who'd faced their own struggles, giving them the kind of opportunity she'd once needed. She paid fair wages and offered flexible schedules for mothers who needed to work around their children's school hours. Helene also began speaking publicly about her experience. At first, it was just small events, local community groups, and high school classes. But word spread about her powerful testimony, and soon she was being invited to speak at conferences and universities. She talked about wrongful convictions, about the failures of the criminal justice system, about the importance of believing victims and questioning narratives that seem too convenient. She talked about resilience and healing and the complicated nature of forgiveness. After one speech at Columbia University, a young Black woman approached her, tears streaming down her face. "My brother is in prison right now," the woman said. "He says he's innocent, but no one believes him. No one except our family. Your story, it gives me hope that maybe we can find the truth too." Helene gave her Janet Morrison's contact information and a list of other organizations that helped with wrongful conviction cases. She hugged the woman and said, "Don't give up. Keep fighting. The truth matters." It was in those moments that Helene felt her suffering transform into something meaningful. She couldn't get her 2 years back, but she could use her experience to help others. She could be the voice for people who had no voice, Meanwhile, Charles Matthews had undertaken his own journey of healing, though his path looked very different. He'd stepped back from the day-to-day operations of his company, appointing a COO to handle most of the management while he focused on his foundation work. The foundation, which he'd renamed the Truth and Justice Initiative, funded legal representation for people claiming wrongful conviction, supported families of the incarcerated, and lobbied for criminal justice reform. He poured himself into the work with an intensity that worried his friends. He barely slept, barely ate, working 18-hour days as if he could somehow atone for his sins through sheer exhaustion. His therapist, Dr. Michael Rodriguez, finally confronted him about it. "Charles, you're punishing yourself. This isn't healing. This is self-flagellation." "Maybe I deserve to be punished," Charles said. "Maybe, but who does it serve? Does your suffering help Helene? Does it help the other people you're trying to aid? Or does it just make you feel like you're doing penance?" Charles had no good answer. "You made a terrible mistake," Dr. Rodriguez continued. "You trusted the wrong people, you didn't question what you should have questioned, and an innocent woman suffered because of it. Those are facts. But you also, when you learned the truth, did everything in your power to make it right. You lost your marriage, your relationship with your mother, your social standing, significant business opportunities. You've dedicated your life to trying to prevent this from happening to others. At some point, you need to forgive yourself." "I don't know how," Charles admitted. "Start by allowing yourself to be human. Start by acknowledging that you can't change the past, only learn from it. Start by believing that you're capable of being more than the worst thing you've ever done." It was advice that took Charles months to begin to internalize. He started trying to take better care of himself. He started allowing himself moments of peace without drowning in guilt. He started believing just a little that maybe redemption was possible. He still thought about Helene constantly. He saw updates about her bakery on social media, read articles about her advocacy work, watched videos of her speeches. He was proud of her, which felt presumptuous given everything, but he was. She'd taken the worst thing that could happen and transformed it into strength. Part of him wanted to reach out to see how she was doing, to maybe eventually have some kind of relationship where they could be friends. But he knew that wasn't his choice to make. Helene would reach out if and when she was ready. Until then, all he could do was continue his work and hope that, someday, she might look at him and see something other than the man who destroyed her life. 2 years after Helene's release, they saw each other again at another gala. This one focused specifically on supporting families of the wrongly convicted. Helene was there as a speaker. Charles was there as a donor. They exchanged polite greetings, the conversation stilted and careful. But there was something different this time. The sharp edge of Helene's anger had softened slightly. She looked healthier, happier, more at peace. "I heard about your bakery," Charles said. "Everyone says it's incredible." "It is," Helene said with a small smile. "I'm really proud of it. It's everything I always wanted. I'm glad. You deserve every happiness." "Thank you." She paused, then said, "I've been following your foundation's work. You've helped a lot of people. I'm trying. It doesn't make up for anything, but it feels like the right thing to do." "It is the right thing to do," Helene said. "Charles, I've been thinking, maybe we could get coffee sometime? Just to talk. No pressure, no expectations. Just, I don't know, maybe it would be good to clear the air properly." Charles felt his heart skip. "I'd like that, if you're sure." "I'm sure," Helene said. I think I'm ready." They exchanged phone numbers, and 2 weeks later, they met at a coffee shop in Brooklyn, neutral territory for both of them. The conversation was awkward at first, both of them dancing around the enormous elephant in the room. But slowly, tentatively, they began to really talk. Helene told him about Jasmine, about the bakery, about her therapy and her journey toward healing. Charles told her about his foundation work, about his estrangement from his mother, about his own therapy and his attempts to become a better person. "I hated you for a long time," Helene said at one point, her voice quiet but steady. "I hated you so much that it consumed me. But my therapist helped me understand that holding on to that hate was only hurting me. You'd already taken 2 years of my life. I wasn't going to let you take any more by living in anger." "I understand," Charles said. "And for what it's worth, I hated myself too. I still do most days." "Don't," Helene said, surprising them both. "Don't hate yourself. That doesn't serve anyone. You made a mistake. A huge, devastating mistake. But you also made it right as much as you could. That counts for something. Does it? Yes, it doesn't erase what happened, but it counts." They talked for 3 hours that day, and when they parted, something had shifted. It wasn't forgiveness, not quite, but it was the beginning of something like understanding. They started meeting for coffee regularly after that. Once a month at first, then every few weeks. The conversations became easier, more natural. They discovered they still enjoyed talking to each other, still had that same connection they'd felt years ago, though now it was complicated by everything that had happened. One day, about 6 months into their renewed friendship, Helene invited Charles to the bakery. It was a Sunday afternoon, after closing, and the space was quiet and warm, filled with the lingering scent of fresh bread. "I wanted you to see it," Helene said. "This place, it's what I built from the ashes of everything that happened. It's proof that I survived." Charles looked around at the cheerful yellow walls, the framed drawings by Jasmine, the photos of Helene's grandmother behind the counter. "It's beautiful. It's perfect. Thank you for the settlement money," Helene said. "I know that probably sounds strange, thanking you for money that came from destroying my life, but it allowed me to build this. It gave me the freedom to create something meaningful." "You built this," Charles said firmly. "Not the money. Your talent, your vision, your strength. The money just gave you the opportunity to show what you were always capable of." Helene smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, it was a smile without shadows. "Maybe you're right. I know I'm right." They sat at one of the small tables, sharing leftover peach cobbler, and talked until the sun set and the bakery grew dark around them. And somewhere in those conversations, in the comfortable silences and the shared laughter, something new began to grow. Not romance, not yet. Neither of them was ready for that. But something that felt like hope. Something that felt like maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward that wasn't defined entirely by the past. There's something profound about watching two people who've been through hell find their way back to each other. Not as enemies, not even as victim and perpetrator, but as two human beings trying to heal. These stories of second chances and redemption, they're not easy or simple, but they're real. They remind us that people are capable of change, of growth, of becoming better than they were. If this story is moving you, if you believe in second chances and the power of forgiveness, do us a favor, hit that subscribe button. Let us know where you're watching from and tell us. Have you ever had to forgive something that seemed unforgivable? Or have you had to seek forgiveness for something you deeply regret? Your stories matter. Share them in the comments. We're all on this journey together. 2 years passed. 2 years of coffee dates and long conversations. 2 years of slowly, carefully rebuilding trust. 2 years of both of them healing, individually and, without quite realizing it, together. Helene's bakery expanded to a second location. Her daughter Jasmine was now 11, thriving in school, a happy, well-adjusted kid who adored her mother and had started helping in the bakery on weekends. Helene had published a memoir about her experience, which had become a surprise bestseller and brought even more attention to issues of wrongful conviction. Charles's foundation had helped free 6 wrongly convicted people and provided support to hundreds of families. His company had fully recovered and was more successful than ever, though Charles maintained his stepped-back role, preferring to focus on meaningful work over pure profit. Margaret had served her 18 months and been released. She'd attempted to contact Charles several times, but he'd maintained his boundaries. Maybe someday he'd be able to have a relationship with his mother again. But not yet. The wound was still too fresh. Alice had served her 4 years and disappeared from public view after her release. Charles heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd moved to Europe, trying to start over where no one knew her story. It was a Saturday evening in April when something shifted between Charles and Helene. They'd fallen into a routine of having dinner together every week, alternating between cooking at Helene's house and going to small restaurants around the city. This week, it was Charles's turn to cook, so they were at his penthouse. He'd sold the old penthouse, too many memories, and bought a different, smaller one. Still luxurious, but more human-scaled, less of a showcase and more of a home. Charles had made pasta from scratch, something he'd learned to do during his many lonely evenings. Helene brought dessert from the bakery, a new recipe she was testing. They ate on his balcony, watching the sun set over Central Park, talking about everything and nothing. At some point during the evening, Charles realized he was happy. Genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy, for the first time in years. And when he looked at Helene, laughing at something he'd said, her face glowing in the golden hour light, he realized something else. He was in love with her. Not the tentative attraction he'd felt years ago, but real, deep, certain love. The realization terrified him. He had no right to love her. He'd hurt her too badly. The best thing he could do was keep his feelings to himself and just be grateful for her friendship. But Helene, who'd always been perceptive, noticed the change in his expression. "What?" she asked. "You got quiet suddenly." "Nothing," Charles said quickly. Just thinking. About." He could lie. He should lie. But they'd built their renewed relationship on honesty, on saying hard things even when it was uncomfortable. "About how happy I am right now," he admitted, "and how I don't deserve to be." Helene set down her wine glass. "Charles, we've talked about this. You've done the work. You've made amends as much as anyone can. At some point, you have to allow yourself to move forward. I know. Intellectually, I know that. But emotionally..." He stopped, unsure how much to reveal. "Emotionally what?" Charles took a deep breath. "Emotionally, I feel things I have no right to feel." Helene was quiet for a moment, and Charles braced himself for her to pull away, to tell him he was crossing a line. But instead, she said softly, "What if you do have the right? What if I want you to feel those things?" Charles's head snapped up. "What?" "I've been thinking too," Helene said, her voice steady despite the vulnerability in her eyes. "I've been thinking about how much my life has changed over the past few years. How I've gone from being angry and broken to being, well, mostly whole. And I've been thinking about the role you've played in that." "Helene, let me finish," she interrupted gently. "You hurt me. You hurt me badly. For a long time, I thought I'd never be able to look at you without feeling that hurt. But somewhere along the way, something changed. I started seeing you not as the person who destroyed my life, but as the person who fought to give it back. As the person who sits with my daughter and helps her with her math homework. As the person who makes me laugh and challenges me and cares about me in a way that feels genuine. I do care about you," Charles said, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I should. More than I have any right to." "Why don't you have the right?" Helene asked. Because of what happened before? Charles, we're not those people anymore. You're not the man who trusted blindly, and I'm not the naive woman who thought kindness was always enough. We've both changed. We've both grown. Why can't we allow ourselves to explore what might be possible now? Because I'm afraid, Charles admitted. I'm afraid of hurting you again. I'm afraid of screwing this up. I'm afraid that everyone will say I'm taking advantage, that you only feel this way because of some kind of Stockholm syndrome or, do you think I'd be here if I didn't want to be? Helene asked, a slight smile on her face. Charles, I'm a grown woman who's been through hell and came out the other side. I know my own mind, and I know that when I'm with you, I feel something I haven't felt in a very long time. I feel seen. I feel valued. I feel like maybe I could love again. The word love hung in the air between them. Could? Charles asked quietly. Could? Helene confirmed. Maybe already do a little, if you'd be interested in finding out. Charles stood up and walked to where Helene sat. He knelt down beside her chair, taking her hand in his. I would be very interested in finding out, but I need you to know, I will spend every day of the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you. I will never take you for granted. I will never stop working to be better. I know, Helene said, tears glistening in her eyes. That's one of the reasons why I'm willing to try this. The media will go crazy, Charles warned. They'll have a field day with this. They'll say terrible things. Let them, Helene said. I stopped caring what strangers think a long time ago. The people who matter, the people who actually know us, they'll understand. Jasmine already knows how I feel, Helene said. I told her I was developing feelings for you. She asked if you were a good man. I told her you'd made mistakes, but that you were trying very hard to be good. She said that was enough for her. She's a remarkable kid. She is. And she deserves to see her mother happy. Really, truly happy. Charles brought Helene's hand to his lips and kissed it gently. I want to make you happy. I want to try. Then try, Helene whispered. He leaned forward and kissed her, soft and tentative at first, then deeper as she responded. It was a kiss weighted with history and pain and hope and possibility. Tasted like forgiveness and new beginnings. When they pulled apart, both of them were crying. This is crazy, Helene said, laughing through her tears. Everyone's going to think we're crazy. Probably, Charles agreed. But I don't care. Do you? No, Helene said. I really don't. They spent the rest of the evening on the balcony, talking about what came next, what this new chapter might look like. They agreed to take things slow, to be thoughtful about how they navigated this with Jasmine, to be prepared for the inevitable public scrutiny. But underneath all the practical concerns, there was a current of joy, of rightness, of two people who'd found their way to each other through the darkest possible circumstances and emerged ready to build something beautiful. Their relationship became public knowledge 3 months later when they were photographed together at a restaurant, holding hands across the table. The media response was exactly as chaotic as they'd anticipated. Some outlets painted it as a beautiful story of forgiveness and redemption. Others suggested it was inappropriate, that the power dynamic was too complicated, that Helene must be motivated by money or continued trauma bonding. Helene addressed it head-on, giving an interview to a respected journalist where she laid out her side of the story. I'm not a victim anymore, she said clearly. I'm a woman who survived something terrible and came out stronger. I'm choosing to build a life with someone who has shown, through years of consistent action, that he's committed to being better. That's my choice, made freely, and I don't owe anyone an explanation beyond that. The interview was widely praised for its honesty and strength. Slowly, the media narrative shifted. People began to see their relationship not as something scandalous but as something hopeful, a testament to the human capacity for change and forgiveness. Jasmine took to Charles gradually. He was patient with her, never trying to replace her grandfather or push too hard for acceptance. He helped with homework, attended her school events, brought her favorite snacks from the bodega. Slowly, she began to trust him. One day, about a year into Charles and Helene's relationship, Jasmine asked him, "Do you love my mom?" "Yes," Charles said simply. "Very much. Are you going to hurt her again?" It was a child's blunt question, but it deserved a real answer. "I'm going to try very hard not to, but I'm human, and humans make mistakes. What I can promise is that I'll always be honest with her. I'll always respect her. And if I do mess up, I'll own it and work to fix it." Jasmine considered this. "Okay, that's good enough. Thanks, Jasmine. You can call me Jazz if you want. That's what my friends call me." "Jazz it is," Charles said, feeling absurdly honored by this small gesture of acceptance. 3 years after Helene's release, 7 years after the day she was arrested, Charles took her back to the penthouse building where it had all happened. They stood outside, looking up at the building where Helene had once worked, where her life had been destroyed. "Why did you bring me here?" Helene asked. "Because I wanted you to know that this place, this building, it doesn't have power over us anymore. What happened here was terrible, but it doesn't define who we are now. We've built something new, something good. And I wanted to stand here, in this spot, and ask you something important." Charles knelt down on one knee, right there on the sidewalk in front of 432 Park Avenue. He pulled out a small velvet box. "Helene Washington, you are the strongest, most resilient, most remarkable person I've ever known. You've taught me about forgiveness, about courage, about what it means to truly rebuild a life from ashes. I know I hurt you. I know our story started in the worst possible way. But I also know that I love you more than I thought it was possible to love someone. And I want to spend the rest of my life showing you how much you mean to me. Will you marry me?" Helene looked down at him, tears streaming down her face, and she started to laugh. "You're proposing to me outside the building where your mother framed me for assault?" "Yes," Charles said, laughing too. "I'm reclaiming this place. We're reclaiming it. This is where the worst thing happened, so I wanted it to also be where one of the best things happened." "Is that crazy?" "It's absolutely crazy," Helene said. Yes, I'll marry you." Charles slipped the ring onto her finger. A simple band with a single diamond, elegant and understated, just like Helene herself. He stood up and kissed her while passers-by on the Manhattan sidewalk clapped and cheered, having no idea of the complicated history that had led to this moment. B-roll. Wedding preparation montage. Intimate ceremony. Happy moments. They were married 6 months later in a small ceremony at grandmother's kitchen, surrounded by the people who mattered most. Jasmine was the maid of honor, taking her role very seriously in a beautiful lavender dress. Charles's business partner stood as his best man, having supported him through everything. Margaret was not invited. Charles had maintained his boundary there. Someday maybe, but not yet. Not for this. The ceremony was officiated by Janet Morrison, who'd gotten ordained online specifically for this occasion. She'd become a good friend to both of them over the years, a constant supporter of their unconventional journey. "We're gathered here today," Janet said with a smile, "to celebrate something truly miraculous. Not just the love between these two people, but the journey they took to get here. Charles and Helene have walked through fire together, not side by side, but sometimes against each other. They've faced the worst of themselves and each other, and they've emerged with a love that's been tested and proven true. This is not a fairy tale. This is something better. This is real." Charles's vows were simple and heartfelt. "Helene, I can't promise I'll never make mistakes, But I can promise that I'll never stop trying to be worthy of you. I promise to listen when you speak, to believe you when you tell me the truth, to stand beside you in joy and in struggle. I promise to be a good partner to you and a good role model for Jasmine. I promise to love you not despite our history, but because of it, because it made us who we are. I promise to spend every day grateful for your presence in my life. Helene's vows were equally powerful. Charles, you hurt me. I'm not going to pretend you didn't, but you also saved me, not just from prison, but from bitterness. You showed me that people can change, that redemption is possible, that love can grow in the most unlikely places. I promise to trust you, to be patient with you when you're struggling with guilt, to remind you that you're more than your worst mistake. I promise to build a life with you that honors both our pasts and our future. I promise to love you, not because it's easy, but because it's worth it. They exchanged rings, kissed to enthusiastic applause, and celebrated with their small gathering over food from the bakery and champagne, and so much laughter that the walls seemed to shake with joy. Later that night, in the home they now shared, Charles and Helene stood on their balcony looking out at the city lights. "Do you ever wonder how we got here?" Helene asked, leaning against Charles's chest, his arms wrapped around her. "Every day," Charles admitted. "Every day I wake up and can't believe this is real, that you chose me, that we made it through everything and came out here." "It wasn't easy," Helene said. "No, it was impossibly hard. But worth it. Worth every painful step," Charles said, kissing the top of her head. "Helene Matthews, you are worth everything." She turned in his arms and smiled up at him. "Helene Matthews, I'm still getting used to that name. We don't have to use it if you don't want to. I know the Matthews name carries a lot of complicated history for you." "No," Helene said firmly. "I'm taking it. I'm reclaiming it. It's not Margaret's name or Alice's name anymore. It's mine. It's ours. It's the name of the family we're building together." "I love you," Charles said. "I love you too," Helene replied. "And I forgive you. Completely. Fully. I forgive you." Those words, the ones Charles had been waiting years to hear, broke something open inside him. He cried, real cathartic tears, and Helene held him while he finally, truly let go of the guilt he'd been carrying. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you. Thank you," Helene said back, "for fighting for me, for never giving up, for becoming the man I needed you to be." They stood there together, two people who'd been broken and had somehow managed to heal each other, ready to face whatever came next. Together. 3 more years passed. 3 years of building a life together that was imperfect and beautiful and real. Charles and Helene expanded the bakery to 5 locations across New York. They started a nonprofit together, combining Charles's foundation with Helene's advocacy work, creating a comprehensive support system for wrongly convicted people and their families. They helped free 12 more innocent people and provided assistance to hundreds of families navigating the impossible aftermath of wrongful imprisonment. Jasmine, now 14, was thriving. She'd even started calling Charles Dad occasionally, which made him tear up every single time. She wanted to be a lawyer when she grew up, inspired by watching Janet Morrison fight for justice. Margaret had reached out several times over the years. Charles had finally agreed to meet with her once at a neutral location with a therapist present. She'd apologized, though it felt hollow, more motivated by her desire to reconnect with her son than genuine remorse for what she'd done to Helene. Charles had accepted her apology but maintained his boundaries. She was his mother and he loved her in a complicated way, but she would never be a significant part of his life again. Alice had apparently remarried to a wealthy businessman in London. Charles heard this through mutual acquaintances and felt nothing. That chapter was completely closed. The thing about surviving trauma, about walking through fire and coming out the other side, is that it changes you fundamentally. You can never go back to who you were before. But if you're lucky, if you do the work, if you're surrounded by the right people, you become someone better. Helene and Charles had both become better. Not perfect, never perfect, but better. They'd learned about forgiveness, not as a single act, but as a daily practice. They'd learned about trust, how to rebuild it one small action at a time. They'd learned about love, the real kind, the kind that sees all your flaws and chooses you anyway. On a Sunday morning in late September, Charles and Helene were at the bakery with Jasmine, teaching her how to make her great-great-grandmother's peach cobbler. The bakery was closed for the day, and they had the space to themselves. More cinnamon? Jasmine asked, following the faded recipe card. Always more cinnamon, Helene said, laughing. Grandma used to say cinnamon was the secret to everything. Charles watched them work together, mother and daughter, heads bent over the mixing bowl, and he felt a contentment so complete it was almost overwhelming. What are you smiling about? Helene asked, noticing his expression. Just thinking about how lucky I am, Charles said. How impossibly, undeservedly lucky. You're not undeserving, Helene said, walking over and kissing him gently. You earned this. We both did. We fought for it. We did, didn't we? We really did. Jasmine rolled her eyes good-naturedly. You guys are so mushy. Wait until you fall in love, Helene teased. Then you'll understand. Not for like 10 years, Jasmine said firmly. I have plans. College, law school, changing the world. That's my girl, Charles said proudly, as the peach cobbler baked, filling the bakery with the scent of cinnamon and sugar and home. Charles thought about the journey that had brought them here. The terrible beginning, the long middle filled with pain and struggle and gradual healing. And now an ending that was really a beginning. People always want stories to be simple. They want clear villains and heroes. They want easy answers and tidy conclusions. But life isn't like that. Life is complicated and messy and full of people who make terrible mistakes and people who survive those mistakes and people who somehow find a way to build something beautiful from the rubble. This story, Charles and Helene's story, wasn't simple. It was a story about injustice and redemption, about hatred and forgiveness, about the long, difficult road from brokenness to wholeness. It was a story about how love, real love, the kind that lasts, isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone who sees all your imperfections, all your failures, all your mistakes, and chooses to build a life with you anyway. It was a story about second chances, about how it's never too late to do the right thing, about how the truth, no matter how long it takes, always matters. And it was a story about hope, about how even in the darkest moments, even when everything seems lost, there's always a possibility of light if you're brave enough to keep looking for it. As the sun set outside the bakery windows, painting the world in shades of gold and orange, Charles, Helene, and Jasmine sat down together to eat the peach cobbler they'd made. It was perfect, sweet and spicy and warm, tasting exactly like love should taste. And in that moment, despite everything they'd been through, despite all the pain and struggle and loss, they were happy. Genuinely, completely, impossibly happy. Because sometimes, if you're very lucky and you work very hard and you never give up on doing what's right, broken things can be mended. Wounds can heal. And love can triumph over even the darkest injustice. The end is never really the end. It's just another beginning. And for Charles, Helene, and Jasmine, this beginning looked bright. This story, like all true stories about the human experience, doesn't have a perfect ending. It has a real ending. An ending where people carried scars but also carried hope. Where mistakes were made but redemption was possible. where love, the complicated, hard-fought kind, won in the end. If this story moved you, if it made you think about justice, forgiveness, second chances, or the power of truth, we'd love to hear from you. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss stories like this. Stories that matter. Stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Have you ever experienced injustice? Have you had to forgive something that seemed unforgivable? Have you watched someone you love transform themselves into something better? Your stories matter. Your experiences matter. Share them with this community, because at the end of the day, we're all just trying to survive our own fires and hoping to come out the other side a little bit better than we were before. And maybe, just maybe, stories like this one can help us believe that it's possible. Thank you for spending these 60 minutes with us. Thank you for believing that truth matters, that redemption is possible, and that love, real love, can overcome even the darkest obstacles. Until next time, keep fighting for what's right, keep believing in second chances, and keep loving with your whole heart, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard.